Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. The scream that echoed through the forest that night wasn't human. It wasn't any animal I'd ever heard before either. And in my 15 years as a park ranger, I thought I'd heard them all. I was on my usual night patrol, flashlight in hand, scanning the dense woods for any signs of trouble. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating patches of undergrowth and tree trunks in eerie snapshots. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. It was a quiet night, the kind where you could hear a twig snap from 100 yards away. That's when I heard it. A blood-curdling howl that sent shivers down my spine and made my hair stand on end. It started low, almost like a rumble, then rose to a pitch that no human throat could produce. I froze in my tracks, my breath caught in my throat. For a moment, all I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then silence. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. I fumbled for my radio, my hands shaking slightly. Bass. This is Ranger Mike. I just heard something out near Black Rock Trail. I'm going to investigate. The radio crackled. Copy that, Mike. Be careful out there. Call if you need backup. I hesitated for a moment, then started moving in the direction of the sound. My boots crunched on fallen leaves and twigs, each step sounding impossibly loud in the quiet forest. I swept my flashlight from side to side, looking for any sign of movement. As I approached a small clearing, something caught my eye. I crouched down, focusing my light on the soft earth. There, pressed into the damp soil, was a footprint, but not like any I'd seen before. It was huge, easily twice the size of my own boot. The impression was deep, suggesting whatever made it was incredibly heavy. But what struck me most were the claw marks at the end of each toe. They dug into the earth, leaving gouges several inches long. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. No bear made tracks like this. No known animal in these woods could leave a print this size. I heard a twig snap behind me and whirled around, my heart leaping into my throat. The beam of my flashlight caught nothing but trees and shadows, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stood slowly, my eyes scanning the tree line. That's when I saw it, a flicker of movement in the shadows, something large, moving with a grace that belied its size. I caught a glimpse of eyes reflecting my flashlight beam, set high off the ground, much higher than any natural predator in these parts. My radio crackled to life, making me jump. Mike, everything okay out there? It's been a while since your last check-in. I fumbled for the radio, my eyes never leaving the spot where I'd seen the movement. Yeah, Base. I'm not sure what I've found here. I think we might have an unidentified predator in the area. I'm seeing some strange tracks. Want us to send someone out? I was about to say yes when I heard it again. That low, rumbling growl. Closer this time, much closer. It seemed to come from all around me, vibrating in my chest. Mike, you there? I realized I was backing away, my feet moving of their own accord. Send someone, I whispered into the radio. Send someone now. I turned and ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. 15 years in these woods, and I've never run from anything. But in that moment, every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out of there. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face. I could hear it behind me, moving through the forest with terrifying speed. Whatever it was big, and it was fast. My lungs burned as I ran, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly ahead of me. I knew the trails like the back of my hand, but in the dark, with fear clouding my mind, everything looked different. I burst out onto a wider trail, my boots slipping on the gravel. I regained my balance and sprinted down the path, praying it was the one that led back to the ranger station. The sound of pursuit was getting closer. I could hear heavy breathing, the snap of branches, the thud of something large moving at high speed. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. In the bouncing beam of my flashlight, I caught a glimpse of something that shouldn't exist. A massive form, easily 7 feet tall, covered in dark fur. It moved on 2 legs with a loping gait that ate up the distance between us. I turned back, running harder than I ever had in my life. My chest felt like it was going to explode, my legs burning with the effort. But I knew if I slowed down, even for a second, I was done for. Up ahead, I saw lights, the ranger station, safety. I pushed myself harder, my feet pounding on the gravel path. Suddenly, something hit me from behind, hard. I went flying, my flashlight spinning away into the darkness. I hit the ground and rolled, the breath knocked out of me. I scrambled to my feet, gasping for air. It was there, just yards away. In the dim light from the distant station, I could make out its massive silhouette. It stood upright, like a man, but there was nothing human about it. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, fixed on me with predatory intensity. For a moment, we stood there, facing each other. I could hear its heavy breathing, smell the wild, musky scent of it. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't exist. It took a step toward me, and I stumbled backward. My hand brushed against something, a branch. I grabbed it, holding it out in front of me like a weapon, though I knew it would do little against this creature. It let out another of those bone-chilling howls, and I saw rows of sharp teeth gleaming in the moonlight. This was it, I thought. This was how I was going to die. Then, suddenly, lights flashed in the distance. The sound of an engine broke through the night. The creature's head snapped toward the noise, then back to me. For a second, I thought it was going to attack anyway. But then it turned and bounded into the forest, disappearing into the shadows with incredible speed. By the time the patrol car pulled up, lights flashing, it was gone. My colleagues found me standing there, wild-eyed and panting, clutching a branch like my life depended on it. They peppered me with questions, but I couldn't find the words to explain what had happened. In the days that followed, we searched the area thoroughly. We found the tracks I'd seen, and others. We found trees with claw marks 10 feet off the ground. But we never found the creature. The official report chalks it up to a bear encounter, but I know what I saw that night. And I know that somewhere out there, in the depths of the forest, something is waiting. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. I still do my patrols. It's my job, after all. But now, when night falls and the forest grows quiet, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. And sometimes, when the wind is right, I swear I can hear that howl in the distance, a reminder that in the wilderness, we're not always at the top of the food chain. Story 2. It was supposed to be a routine patrol, just another quiet night in the forest, but something was different. I could feel it the moment I stepped out of my truck. The air was heavier, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. The wind, which usually whistled softly through the pines, had gone dead silent. Only the faintest rustling of leaves broke the stillness, but even that felt unnatural, like the forest was shifting in anticipation. I had been a park ranger for over 8 years, and I'd seen my share of strange things, but this was something else. My shift had started normally enough, just a few hours ago. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the trails as I made my rounds through the familiar stretch of forest. It was a remote section of the park, miles away from any main roads or campgrounds, the kind of place where only experienced hikers ventured. I liked it that way. I enjoyed the solitude, the peace of being out in nature without the constant hum of civilization in the background. But tonight, that peace felt like a trap, a thick blanket of silence suffocating the usual sounds of the wild. I checked my radio, though I didn't expect much. Reception was always spotty this deep into the woods. Sure enough, just static greeted me when I pressed the button. That didn't bother me much, I've handled worse. But it was as I began walking down the trail, flashlight sweeping through the trees, that I first noticed the tracks. They were fresh, clearly outlined in the dirt just off the main path. At first glance, they looked like regular wolf prints, but something about them made my skin prickle. They were larger than any wolf I'd ever seen, much larger. I knelt down, shining the light closer to get a better look. Each paw was wide, the claws digging deep into the earth as if something heavy had passed through here recently. I stood up slowly, my pulse quickening. Wolves weren't uncommon in the area, but we hadn't had any reports of them venturing this close to the trails, and certainly nothing this big. I glanced around, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but everything was still. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of something moving in the distance. A low rustle at first, just a brush of branches against each other, but it grew louder. The movement steady, deliberate. Whatever it was big, and it wasn't trying to hide its presence. I froze, my hand instinctively moving to the radio on my shoulder. Static, useless. I considered heading back to the truck, but something in me resisted. Call it curiosity, or maybe stupidity, but I had to see what was out there. I wasn't about to let some overgrown animal scare me off my own patrol route. I stepped off the trail, following the direction of the sound, my flashlight sweeping side to side. The beam caught glimpses of tree trunks, scattered underbrush, but nothing out of the ordinary. Yet that feeling of being watched, of being stalked, only grew stronger. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing on end, a primal warning from some deep, buried instinct. And then, there it was. At first, I only caught a glimpse, just a flash of movement between the trees, something darting past, too fast for me to get a clear look. I stopped, my heart hammering in my chest, and scanned the area again, straining my ears. Silence. Total, suffocating silence. I was just about to turn back when I saw it. Not 20 yards ahead, standing between two massive pines, was a figure. It was tall, too tall to be any animal I knew, standing at least 7 feet, if not more. The beam of my flashlight caught its eyes first, glowing with an unnatural amber sheen, like the eyes of a predator reflecting light in the dark. My breath caught in my throat as I took a step back, my mind scrambling to process what I was seeing. It was covered in thick, matted fur, its body massive and hunched, with long arms that nearly touched the ground. But it wasn't the sheer size that terrified me. It was the fact that it stood on 2 legs. The way its head was cocked to the side, those eyes locked onto me. There was something almost human in its posture, yet everything about it screamed danger. For a moment, neither of us moved. It just stood there, watching me, the rise and fall of its chest the only indication that it was alive. Then, without warning, it let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that reverberated through my bones. My hands trembled, and I could barely keep the flashlight steady. The sound was deep, primal, more like a rumble of thunder than any noise an animal should make. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to run, but I knew better. Running would trigger something in it, something predatory. I'd seen it before in wolves and bears. The moment you run, you become prey. But the creature didn't charge. It just watched. The low growl fading into the night air, as if it was waiting for me to make the next move. I slowly began to retreat, keeping my eyes on the figure, refusing to turn my back to it. My boots crunched softly on the forest floor, each step echoing in the silence that had once again fallen over the woods. The creature remained where it was, its amber eyes tracking me, never blinking, never breaking contact. I was nearly to the trail when a branch snapped behind me. I whipped around, heart leaping into my throat, the beam of my flashlight shaking wildly as I tried to locate the source of the sound. But there was nothing there, just darkness, thick and impenetrable. I turned back to the spot where the creature had been. It was gone. The air around me felt heavier now, thick with an oppressive tension that made it hard to breathe. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if a dozen unseen eyes were watching me from the shadows. I started moving faster, nearly jogging down the trail, my hand gripping the radio tight, even though I knew it wouldn't help. Suddenly, the forest came alive with noise. Branches snapped in the distance, leaves rustled violently as something massive barreled through the underbrush. I could hear it behind me, the heavy thud of footfalls growing closer, faster. I broke into a run. My breath came in ragged gasps as I sprinted down the trail, my flashlight bobbing wildly in my hand, casting erratic beams of light across the trees. I could hear it gaining on me, the sound of its pursuit unmistakable now. Whatever this thing was, it was fast, too fast for something so large. I could see the glint of my truck's headlights through the trees, the vehicle parked just where I'd left it. Safety was only a few hundred feet away, but it felt like miles. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning, lungs aching, every muscle screaming in protest. Just as I reached the edge of the clearing, I felt it, an overwhelming sense of presence, like a massive shadow looming over me. I didn't dare look back. I lunged for the truck, slamming into the door and yanking it open with shaking hands. I threw myself inside, locking the doors just as something crashed into the side of the truck with a force that nearly tipped it over. The entire vehicle rocked, the windows vibrating from the impact. I scrambled to start the engine, my hands slipping on the keys in my panic. With a roar, the engine came to life, and I floored the gas pedal, the tires spinning in the dirt before finally catching traction. I sped down the narrow dirt road, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. The forest blurred by in a haze of green and black, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching me. Even as the truck rattled over the uneven terrain, my mind was consumed with the image of those amber eyes glowing in the dark. It wasn't until I reached the station and slammed the truck into park that I finally allowed myself to breathe. My hands were still shaking as I sat there, staring at the steering wheel, trying to process what had just happened. I'd encountered predators before, bears, wolves, mountain lions, but this was something else, something I couldn't explain. I never spoke about that night to anyone, not officially at least. Who would believe me? But every time I step back into those woods, I feel it, that presence. That thing, watching, waiting just beyond the trees, and I know deep down that one day it will return. Story 3. The night had fallen fast, as it tends to do in the deep wilderness. The fire crackled weakly in the center of our small camp, sending up thin trails of smoke that quickly disappeared into the dense canopy overhead. We'd pitched our tents right along the riverbank, miles away from any road or town, just the way we liked it. Isolation, peace, the distant rush of water lulling us to sleep, that was the plan. But nature, as we were about to find out, doesn't care much for plans. At first, it was just small talk, and the typical camp banter, 4 friends drinking beer, poking at the fire, and settling into the rhythm of the wild. No phones, no distractions, just the sound of the river and the occasional snap of a twig from some harmless animal moving in the underbrush. I was the first to notice the change, although I didn't say anything at first. The air had grown still, too still. Even the river seemed quieter somehow, its steady flow now a soft murmur. Something felt wrong, though I couldn't quite place it. Maybe it was just the silence creeping in after hours of laughter and chatter, but the forest felt off. You spend enough time out here, and you develop a sense for when things aren't normal. My gut was telling me to be on guard, but I shrugged it off as the after effects of a long day of hiking and a few too many beers. It was Alex who heard the first sound. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low, but with a sharp edge of curiosity that immediately caught my attention. We all fell silent, listening. At first, I didn't catch anything, just the distant rush of the river and the crackling of the fire. But then it came again, a soft splash, like something heavy had dropped into the water, a few rocks maybe, tumbling off the bank into the river. It wasn't exactly strange. Rivers move things all the time, but the night was still, the kind of stillness where even the smallest sounds carry for miles, and this splash felt deliberate. "What was that?" Jake asked, looking around, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. He sounded calm, but I could see the unease creeping into his eyes. "I don't know," Alex said, leaning forward a little, staring in the direction of the riverbank. "Probably just some animal. Maybe a deer crossing the river." That made sense. Or at least it was a reasonable enough explanation for the moment. Still, I found myself standing up, grabbing my flashlight and directing its beam toward the water. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the surface of the river, but nothing out of the ordinary appeared, just smooth, glassy water reflecting the pale glow of the moon. But then there was a noise, another splash, louder this time, followed by the distinct sound of someone moving through the water. "Maybe it's a bear," Sam suggested, though even he didn't sound convinced. A bear would make noise crashing through the brush, not stealthily wading through a river. "No way," I muttered, shaking my head. "A bear wouldn't come this close to the fire. They'd avoid us unless we had food out." I swept the flashlight back and forth across the riverbank. The beam caught only the shimmering surface of the water, the occasional rock protruding from the shallows, and the thick trees standing like silent sentinels on the opposite bank. No movement, no signs of life, just shadows and water. For a long moment, everything was still again, and I began to wonder if we were overreacting. Maybe it was just our nerves playing tricks on us. Maybe it really had been nothing more than a few rocks dislodged by the current. But then, just as I was about to sit back down, another splash echoed from the opposite bank, louder, closer. Something large was in the water. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest as the flashlight's beam snapped back to the river, and that's when I saw it. There, on the far side of the river, a massive figure stood at the water's edge. At first, I thought it was a man, a huge man, impossibly tall, easily over 7 feet. But as I focused the light, the details sharpened, and my stomach dropped. This was no man. The thing was covered in thick, dark hair, its body hunched forward slightly as if in anticipation of something. Its arms were long, unnaturally long, nearly reaching the ground as it stood upright. And those eyes, its eyes glowed faintly in the beam of the flashlight, reflecting the light like a predator's, eerily animalistic. "What the hell is that?" Jake whispered, his voice tight with fear. No one answered. We just stood there, frozen, staring across the river at the figure that now seemed to be watching us just as intently as we were watching it. The creature's head tilted slightly, as if curious, but there was a malice in its posture, a slow, deliberate menace that set every nerve in my body on edge. And then, with terrifying suddenness, it moved. The creature took a step into the river, the water splashing up around its legs as it waded forward. I swear I could hear the deep, guttural sound of its breathing as it got closer, the heavy, wet thud of its feet hitting the water growing louder with each step. "Get in the tents," I whispered harshly. Not sure why I thought that would help, but needing to do anything. "Hell no," Alex said, his voice barely audible. "We need to leave, now." But leaving wasn't exactly an option either. The creature was moving closer, too close. We were at least 10 miles from the nearest road, our only vehicle parked half a mile back from the river. Running seemed impossible, especially with that thing watching us. The fire crackled between us and the riverbank, but I doubted it would do much to deter whatever the hell this thing was. My hands shook as I fumbled for the hatchet I had stuck in a log next to the fire pit, my only weapon, but I wasn't even sure if it mattered. What was a hatchet going to do against something like that? The creature reached the middle of the river now, and I could see the water only reached its knees. Whatever it was massive. I took a step back, still holding the flashlight in one hand. The beam locked onto the thing's face. Its eyes flicked toward me, locking onto the light. Suddenly, it stopped, standing perfectly still in the middle of the river, its dark, wet fur glistening under the beam of the flashlight. For a moment, it just watched, as if deciding what to do next. Then, Without warning, it let out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the air like thunder. The sound was deep, primal, sending a shiver down my spine. I held my breath, too terrified to move, to even blink. The creature turned its head slightly, glancing at each of us in turn. It knew we were trapped, vulnerable, and then it began to back away, slowly, methodically, until it disappeared into the darkness of the opposite bank. We stood there in stunned silence, listening as the sound of its footsteps faded into the night. The forest, once again, fell into an eerie, suffocating stillness. What the hell was that? Alex finally broke the silence, his voice trembling. None of us had an answer. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. But no rational explanation came. It wasn't a bear, and it sure as hell wasn't human. But whatever it was smart enough to stalk us without charging, without making its move right away. "We need to leave," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "Now!" "But it's out there," Jake said, his eyes wide with fear. "We can't just walk through the woods at night. What if it's waiting for us?" I glanced back at the fire, the small, fragile flames, barely enough to hold back the darkness that surrounded us. The thought of staying out here, exposed, unprotected, made my stomach turn. But Jake was right. If that thing was still out there, it could be watching us right now, ready to strike the moment we let our guard down. "We'll take the trail back to the truck," I said, trying to sound confident. "Keep the flashlights on and stay close together. We move now." No one argued. We packed up what little we could in silence, the fire casting long, flickering shadows across the campsite. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the bushes had us jumping, paranoid that the creature had returned. My hands were shaking as I shoved my gear into my pack, glancing constantly over my shoulder. Within minutes, we were on the trail. Flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness, the river fading behind us. Every step felt like it took an eternity. The silence of the woods pressing in on us from all sides. The only sound was the crunch of our boots on the dirt and the occasional nervous breath from one of us. I don't know how long we walked, but the entire time I could feel it. The sense of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, tracking our every move. When we finally reached the truck, we piled in without a word, slamming the doors and locking them as if that could keep the creature out. My hands were still shaking as I turned the key, the engine roaring to life. As I drove down the narrow dirt road, the beam of the headlights illuminated the forest ahead, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That somewhere, hidden in the shadows, those glowing eyes were still watching us, waiting. And as the trees swallowed up the road behind us, I couldn't help but wonder if we'd really escaped, or if we'd just delayed the inevitable. Story 4. The snapping of twigs in the darkness jolted me awake. It wasn't the gentle rustling of a small animal foraging in the night. No, these were heavy, deliberate footsteps circling our campsite. Something big was out there, and it was getting closer. My wife Sarah and I had been planning this camping trip for months. We were both city folks, but we'd always dreamed of experiencing the great outdoors. So we packed up our shiny new gear, drove 4 hours into the wilderness, and set up camp in a secluded clearing we'd found just off the main trail. The day had been perfect. We'd hiked, fished in a nearby stream, and roasted marshmallows over a crackling fire. As the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, we'd crawled into our tent, exhausted but happy. Now, in the pitch black of night, that happiness had turned to dread. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the underbrush. My heart pounded in my chest as I gently shook Sarah awake. "Don't make a sound," I whispered, my mouth close to her ear. "There's something outside." I felt her stiffen beside me, her breath catching in her throat. We lay there, barely daring to breathe, as the footsteps continued their circuit around our tent. Snap, crunch, snap. Whatever it was taking its time, methodically exploring our campsite. I heard the clatter of our cooking gear, followed by a low, rumbling sound that was neither growl nor roar, but something in between. Sarah's hand found mine in the darkness, squeezing it tightly. I wanted to reassure her, to tell her it was probably just a curious bear or deer, but the words stuck in my throat, because deep down, I knew this was something else entirely. The footsteps paused directly outside our tent. I could hear heavy breathing, feel the presence of something massive just inches away from us. The thin fabric of our tent suddenly felt absurdly inadequate. Then slowly, deliberately, something pressed against the side of the tent. The nylon rippled and bulged inward, outlining what looked like an enormous hand or paw. 5 distinct protrusions pressed into the fabric, each ending in a sharp point that threatened to puncture the material. I bit back a scream, every muscle in my body tensing. Sarah's grip on my hand was so tight it was painful, but I barely noticed. All I could focus on was that massive appendage, so close I could have reached out and touched it. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, the creature stood there, its hand pressed against our tent. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it withdrew. The footsteps resumed, moving away from us and back into the forest. We lay there, frozen, for what must have been hours. Eventually, the first light of dawn began to filter through the tent fabric. Only then did we dare to move. What was that? Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. Slowly, cautiously, we unzipped the tent and peered outside. Our campsite looked like it had been hit by a whirlwind. Our cooking gear was scattered everywhere, pots and pans dented and scratched. The cooler had been upended, its contents strewn across the forest floor, but it was the ground that made my blood run cold. There, pressed deeply into the soft earth, were footprints, enormous footprints, easily twice the size of my own feet. They circled our tent, just as we'd heard in the night. I crouched down to examine one more closely. The imprint was clear, showing 5 toes. No, not toes. These were more like fingers, each ending in a sharp claw mark. "Tom!" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "What could have made these?" I stood up slowly, my eyes scanning the tree line. The forest seemed different now, no longer welcoming and beautiful, but dark and full of secrets. "I don't know," I replied honestly, "but I think we should pack up and leave." We moved quickly, throwing our gear haphazardly into our backpacks. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made us jump. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. As I was rolling up the tent, I noticed something that made my stomach lurch. There, on the side of the tent, where we'd felt the pressure in the night, were 5 distinct marks. The fabric was stretched and distorted, and at the tip of each mark was a small puncture. I showed Sarah, and saw the color drain from her face. Without a word, we redoubled our efforts to pack, driven by a primal need to get away from this place. Just as we were about to leave, I noticed something glinting in the underbrush. Cautiously, I approached and found a tuft of coarse, dark hair caught on a thorny branch. It was like no animal hair I'd ever seen before, too coarse for a bear, too long for a wolf. I hesitated for a moment, then carefully placed the hair in a small plastic bag and tucked it into my pocket. Part of me wanted to leave it behind, to pretend this had all been a bad dream. But another part, the part that had always been fascinated by the unknown, couldn't let this mystery go. We set off down the trail at a brisk pace, constantly looking over our shoulders. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful yesterday, now felt oppressive. Shadows seemed to move at the corner of my vision, and more than once I could have sworn I heard heavy footsteps paralleling our path, just out of sight in the dense undergrowth. It wasn't until we reached our car, parked at the trailhead, that we finally began to relax. As we drove away, I saw Sarah visibly unclench, the tension leaving her body. "Let's never do that again," she said with a nervous laugh. I nodded in agreement, but my mind was already racing. What had we encountered out there? The footprints, the hair, the sheer size of whatever had visited our camp. None of it matched any known animal. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about our experience. I researched local wildlife, but nothing came close to what we'd encountered. I even reached out to a few cryptozoology forums, sharing our story and the details of what we'd seen. Most dismissed it as a bear encounter or even an elaborate hoax, but a few seemed genuinely interested, asking for more details and speculating on what it could have been. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Wendigo, names of legendary creatures were thrown around, each more fantastic than the last. I knew how it sounded. If someone had told me this story a month ago, I would have laughed it off. But I couldn't shake the memory of those footsteps in the night, the massive hand pressed against our tent, the feeling of being watched by something ancient and unknown. Sarah wanted to put the whole thing behind us, and I couldn't blame her. But for me, that night had awakened something, a curiosity, a need to understand what was out there in the deep woods. I found myself planning another trip, this time alone. I bought better gear, a trail camera, even took some tracking classes. Sarah thought I was crazy, but she understood. She made me promise to be careful, to check in regularly. As I write this, I'm preparing for that trip. Tomorrow, I'll head back into those woods. I don't know what I'll find out there, or if I'll find anything at all, but I know that whatever happened that night changed me. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things in this world we don't understand, creatures that lurk just beyond the edge of civilization. And somewhere out there, in the shadows of the forest, something is waiting. Something that defies explanation, that challenges everything we think we know about the natural world. I don't know if I'll find answers on this trip, but I do know one thing. I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. Because now I know that when you venture into the wild, you're not always at the top of the food chain. Sometimes you're being watched, and sometimes the legends are real. Story 5. The wind howled through the jagged peaks, carrying the kind of chill that sank deep into your bones. The snowstorm had rolled in faster than any of us anticipated, swallowing the trail in a blanket of white. There's something about being up in the mountains. When the storm comes, you realize just how small and fragile you are. You can feel the weight of it pressing down on you, like nature itself is reminding you that out here, you're not in control. We should have turned back. Every instinct screamed at me to head for the tree line, find shelter, wait it out. But Mike was determined to push forward, and I didn't want to look like a coward. It was supposed to be a straightforward trip, a hike into the Rockies, get a few good photos, and call it a weekend. But now, with the snow whipping around us and visibility dropping to practically nothing, the whole thing felt like a bad idea. The storm had a way of messing with your senses. Everything was white, swirling, and disorienting. The trail markers were impossible to see, and the only sound was the relentless wind howling in your ears, drowning out all other noise. My boots crunched in the snow as I tried to keep pace with Mike, who was just a few steps ahead but barely visible through the flurry. "Mike, I think we should stop," I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the wind. He didn't respond, or maybe he didn't hear me. I wasn't sure anymore. I trudged forward, my head down, trying to keep warm as the snow pelted my face. Each step felt like a fight, the cold seeping in through my layers, numbing my fingers, my toes. My backpack, which had felt light when we started, now felt like it was filled with rocks, dragging me down with every step. Then something changed. At first I couldn't put my finger on it, but I realized that the sound of the wind wasn't the only thing I was hearing. It was subtle, almost lost in the storm, but it was there, a low, almost imperceptible wail, a sound that didn't belong. I stopped walking, listening intently. There it was again, like a scream, distant but unmistakable. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, colder than the snow around me. It was too far off to be Mike, and too strange to be the wind. I spun around, trying to orient myself in the endless white. Mike was gone, lost in the storm. Panic clawed at my chest, but I forced myself to breathe. He couldn't be far, I thought. I just needed to catch up, or call out, or... Then I heard it again, closer this time, that same wailing, cutting through the wind like a knife, high-pitched and haunting. It sounded almost human, almost, but there was something wrong about it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My instincts kicked in. My feet wanted to move, to run back the way I'd come, but I couldn't leave Mike. He was my friend, and if he was in trouble, I had to find him. I pulled the scarf tighter around my face and pushed forward, the wind biting into me as I struggled through the snow. The sound came again, louder now, echoing through the mountains. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from, but it was close, too close. My breath came in short, sharp bursts as I tried to keep calm. Whatever it was, I needed to get out of here, now. Suddenly, through the blinding snow, I saw a shadow, a figure up ahead, hunched, moving slowly. Relief flooded my chest. "Mike!" I yelled, my voice cracking. "Mike, wait up!" The figure stopped. For a moment, I thought he'd heard me, but something was wrong. The way it stood, the way it moved. It wasn't right. Too tall. Too off. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but the figure disappeared into the storm as quickly as it had appeared. My heart pounded in my chest. I wasn't sure what I had seen, but I knew one thing for certain. That hadn't been Mike. The wailing came again, sharper this time, and I swore it was coming from right behind me. I spun around, half expecting to see something standing there in the snow, but there was nothing. Just the storm, relentless and unforgiving. The cold was getting worse. My limbs felt heavy, sluggish, like the snow was pulling me down. I couldn't stay out here much longer. I had to find Mike and get to shelter before the storm buried us both. I moved faster, stumbling through the snowdrifts, my legs burning with the effort. The sound, whatever it was, followed me. It felt like it was circling me, closing in, that eerie wail piercing the storm again and again. And then, as I stumbled over a small rise, I saw it. The figure. Again. This time it was closer. It was standing perfectly still, its outline just barely visible through the blizzard. It wasn't Mike. It wasn't human. I could see that now. The shape was all wrong, too tall, too thin, like something stretched beyond its natural proportions. Its skin, or what I thought was skin, was pale, almost blending into the snow around it. And its face, God, its face was wrong, hollow, no eyes that I could see, just a mouth, open in a silent scream. I froze. My mind screamed at me to run, to get the hell out of there, but my body refused to move. I could only stare at it, my heart hammering in my chest, every instinct screaming that this thing, whatever it was, shouldn't exist. Then it moved. It didn't walk. It glided silently over the snow, as if the storm itself was carrying it. That mouth, that horrible gaping mouth, stayed open, emitting that wailing sound that had haunted me through the storm. I turned and ran. The snow clawed at my legs, making every step feel like I was moving in slow motion. My lungs burned, each breath a painful gasp of freezing air, but I didn't care. All I could think about was getting away from that thing. I stumbled and fell, face first into the snow. For a moment, the cold shocked me, and I lay there, paralyzed, feeling the ice seep through my clothes, freezing me to the core. But then I heard it again, that wail, closer now, right behind me. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding in my throat, and pushed forward. The storm was disorienting, but I had to move, had to keep going. The snow was coming down even harder now, and I could barely see 2 feet in front of me. But it didn't matter. All I knew was that I needed to get away. I didn't know how long I ran, minutes, hours. It all blurred together in the chaos of the storm. But eventually, the wailing began to fade. I dared to glance over my shoulder. Nothing. The figure, whatever it had been, was gone. I slowed my pace, breathing heavily, my body trembling with exhaustion and cold, but the sense of danger hadn't left me. I was still alone in the middle of a snowstorm, and Mike was still out there. I turned back to the trail, or at least what I thought was the trail. The snow had covered everything, erasing any sign of where we had come from. I was lost. "Mike!" I yelled, my voice hoarse. "Mike, where are you?" No answer, just the wind. I don't know how long I searched, but it felt like hours. My body was aching, my fingers numb, my face stinging from the cold. I was about to give up, to collapse in the snow and let the storm take me, when I heard it, a voice, faint but unmistakable. "Help! Me!" It was Mike. I turned, scanning the whiteout for any sign of him. There, off to the side, I saw a dark shape slumped in the snow. I rushed over, my legs barely able to carry me, and there he was. Mike, half buried, his face pale, his lips blue. "Mike!" I shook him, trying to rouse him. His eyes fluttered open, but he didn't respond. I hauled him up as best as I could, slinging his arm over my shoulder. I didn't have time to think about the figure, about the wailing. I just had to get us both out of here. With Mike leaning heavily on me, I started moving, forcing my way through the storm. Step by agonizing step, we made our way down the mountain, back toward the tree line. The snow seemed to relent, just slightly, as if whatever had been out there was satisfied that we were leaving. When we finally stumbled into the trees, the storm seemed to lessen, the wind no longer howling in our ears. I found a small outcropping, a place to hunker down and wait for the worst of the storm to pass. We never talked about what happened up there, not really. Mike claimed he didn't remember much after the storm hit, just that he had heard something strange before everything went black. But I remember the figure, that mouth, the wailing that seemed to follow me through the snow. And sometimes, even now, when the wind howls just right, I hear it again, that scream. Story 6. The moment I saw those photos, I knew my life would never be the same. What I captured through my lens that day in the dense forest wasn't just unexpected, it was impossible. And now, as I sit in my tent, listening to the heavy breathing just outside, I realize I've become part of a mystery I never asked to uncover. My name is Alex Reeves, and I've been a wildlife photographer for over a decade. I've captured images of elusive snow leopards in the Himalayas and swam with great white sharks off the coast of South Africa. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. It started as a routine assignment. A nature magazine wanted a series on the diverse wildlife in the old-growth forests. I packed my gear, said goodbye to my wife, and headed into the wilderness for a 2-week solo expedition. The first few days were uneventful. I got some great shots of black bears, a family of otters playing in a stream, and even a glimpse of a rarely seen fisher. But it was on the 5th day that everything changed. I'd set up my blind near a small clearing, hoping to catch some deer or elk coming to graze in the early morning light. As the sun began to peek through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor, I saw movement at the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was a bear. The figure was large and dark, moving with a lumbering gait. I started snapping photos, my camera clicking rapidly, but as the creature moved into a shaft of sunlight, I realized this was no bear. It walked on 2 legs. My heart started racing, but years of experience kept my hands steady on the camera. Through my telephoto lens, I could see details that made no sense. The creature was covered in dark, matted fur. Its arms were long, hanging below its knees, and its face. I only caught a glimpse as it turned, but it was a face that haunted the line between human and animal. In a matter of seconds, it was gone, disappearing back into the thick undergrowth. I sat there, stunned, my finger still on the shutter button. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? With shaking hands, I reviewed the photos on my camera's display. There it was, in high-resolution detail, a creature that shouldn't exist, captured in a series of crispy, clear images. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, barely able to focus on my work. As night fell, I retreated to my tent, eager to transfer the photos to my laptop for a closer look. What I saw on the larger screen both thrilled and terrified me. The creature was even more extraordinary than I'd realized. Its musculature was unlike anything I'd seen, powerful yet strangely proportioned. The hands were massive, with opposable thumbs and long, curved claws, but it was the eyes that truly shook me. In one photo, it had turned towards the camera, and I could see intelligence in those eyes. Not the simple cognition of an animal, but something deeper, almost human. I stayed up late into the night, poring over the images, trying to make sense of what I'd captured. It was nearly 2 a.m. when I heard it, a heavy rustling outside my tent. At first, I dismissed it as a raccoon or perhaps a curious deer. But then I heard deep, rhythmic breathing. Something large was out there, circling my campsite. My heart pounded as I reached for my flashlight. Should I look outside, call for help? But I was miles from the nearest ranger station, and my satellite phone was in my backpack on the other side of the tent. The breathing grew closer, and I could hear the snap of twigs under heavy footsteps. Then, silence. Whatever it was, it had stopped right outside my tent. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. The silence stretched on, broken only by the pounding of my own heart in my ears. Then, ever so slowly, I saw the side of my tent begin to move. Something was pressing against it from the outside. The fabric stretched, outlining what could only be a massive hand. In that moment, I knew. The creature I had photographed, it had found me. I wanted to scream, to run, but fear had me paralyzed. I watched, wide-eyed, as the hand slowly explored the contours of my tent. It moved with a deliberate curiosity, as if trying to understand this strange structure. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute, the hand withdrew. I heard more rustling, and then the sound of retreating footsteps. It wasn't until the forest had been silent for a full hour that I dared to move. My muscles ached from the prolonged tension as I cautiously unzipped the tent and peered outside. The campsite looked undisturbed, but there, in the soft earth, were footprints, huge, humanoid footprints, with clear impressions of 5 toes and sharp claw marks. I sank to my knees, my mind reeling. This was real. All of it was real. As the first light of dawn began to break through the trees, I knew I had a decision to make. I could pack up and leave, return to the safety of civilization with my photographic evidence, or I could stay, try to learn more about this incredible creature. The sensible part of me screamed to leave, but the photographer, the explorer in me, I couldn't walk away from this, not yet. I spent the next week in a state of hyper-vigilance, my camera always at the ready. I saw fleeting glimpses of the creature, or perhaps creatures, plural, but never got another clear shot. But I found more evidence. Strange markings on trees, tufts of coarse hair caught on branches, and once, what looked like a crude shelter made of broken branches and leaves. Each night, I could hear them moving around my camp, sometimes close, sometimes at a distance, but always there. I slept little, jumping at every sound. On my last night in the forest, I woke to find my camera bag open, my spare memory cards scattered on the ground. Nothing was damaged, but as I gathered the cards, I realized one was missing. That's when I saw it, the creature standing at the edge of my campsite. In its massive hand, it held my missing memory card. Our eyes met, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. There was intelligence in those eyes, and something more, curiosity, warning. I couldn't be sure. Then, with deliberate care, it placed the memory card on a nearby rock and retreated into the forest. The message was clear. It had seen my photos, and it was letting me know. As I pack up my camp this morning, preparing to return to civilization, I'm left with more questions than answers. What are these creatures? How have they remained hidden for so long? And what do I do with this knowledge? The photos on my camera could change everything, shake the foundations of zoology, anthropology, and our very understanding of human evolution. But as I think about those intelligent eyes, I wonder, do I have the right to expose their existence? For now, I've decided to keep this discovery to myself. I'll hide the memory cards, bide my time, and carefully consider my next move. But I know one thing for certain. I'll be coming back to these woods. There are mysteries here, waiting to be uncovered, and somehow I've become part of this story. As I hike back towards my car, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, not with malice, but with a keen, intelligent curiosity. I turn for one last look at the forest, and for a split second, I swear I see a large, dark figure among the trees. It raises a hand, not in threat, but almost like a farewell. I raise my hand in return, then turn and continue down the trail. Whatever happens next, I know my life has changed forever. The forest has shared its secret with me, and now I carry the weight of that knowledge. But as I emerge from the tree line and see my car waiting in the parking lot, a strange mix of excitement and trepidation washes over me, because I know deep in my bones that this isn't the end of the story. It's only the beginning. Story 7. The radio crackled with static, fading in and out as I drove down the long dirt road that led to the abandoned farmstead deep in the heart of the forest. "You're headed to the old Levington place, right?" Dispatch asked, the voice barely audible through the interference. "Yeah, that's the one," I replied, tightening my grip on the steering wheel. "They said something about strange noises out there." "Yeah, a couple of hikers reported hearing howling, not coyotes though. Something bigger, they said. Could be wolves, but we haven't had any in this area for years." Wolves. Out here. That wasn't exactly comforting. The old Levington place had been abandoned for years, left to rot in the middle of the woods. Nobody went there unless they had a good reason, and I couldn't think of many. The idea of something large lurking around there didn't sit right with me, but part of the job was checking out weird calls like this. Just another lonely patrol in the wilderness. No big deal. As I pulled up to the clearing, the farmhouse loomed in the distance, a skeletal structure against the backdrop of the forest. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the place, making it look even more eerie than I remembered. I parked the truck, cut the engine, and the silence that followed was immediate, oppressive. I stepped out, feeling the chill in the air despite it being early fall. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no wind rustling through the trees, just an uncomfortable, thick silence that settled over everything. My boots crunched on the gravel as I approached the dilapidated barn at the edge of the property. That's where the hikers had said they heard the sounds, coming from inside the barn. The barn door creaked ominously as I pulled it open, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, the beam cutting through the dust-filled air. Inside, everything was as I expected. Old, decaying wooden beams, piles of hay long since dried up, and rusted tools strewn about as if the owners had left in a hurry and never looked back. But there was something else, too, the smell. It hit me hard, an overwhelming stench of wet fur and decay, like something had been living in here or dying in here. I stepped cautiously inside, my flashlight sweeping over the ground, the walls, the ceiling. That's when I saw the scratches, deep gouges in the wood, like something with claws had raked them across the support beams. My heart picked up its pace as I knelt down to inspect them. They were fresh. "What the hell?" I muttered under my breath. I stood up slowly, my senses on high alert now, listening for any sign of movement. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It was coming from deeper inside the barn, behind a stack of hay bales near the back wall. I froze, straining my ears, trying to pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. Another growl, louder this time, closer. I took a step back, reaching for the pistol on my belt. Whatever was in here with me, it wasn't something I wanted to meet unarmed. I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. "If someone's in here, show yourself. I'm with the park service." No response, just another growl, low, guttural, and unmistakably animal. My hand tightened around the grip of my gun as I moved toward the back of the barn, my flashlight cutting through the dark corners. I could see something now, a shape shifting in the shadows. And then it moved. A massive figure shot out from behind the hay bales, too fast for me to get a good look at. I stumbled back, nearly losing my balance, my flashlight jerking wildly as the creature disappeared into the darkness outside the barn. The sound of heavy, lumbering footsteps pounded through the dirt as it ran. I bolted for the door, adrenaline pumping through my veins, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. I reached the opening and swung the flashlight out into the night, scanning the clearing. There it was, standing just beyond the tree line, its eyes reflecting the light back at me, two glowing orbs high off the ground, watching me with an intensity that sent a cold shiver down my spine. The creature was massive, at least 7 feet tall, standing on 2 legs like a man, but covered in dark, matted fur. Its head was too large, too wolf-like, and those eyes, they never left me, locked onto mine like it was sizing me up, deciding whether or not to come back for me. I didn't dare move. The air between us felt charged, like the slightest motion could trigger something terrible. The creature let out a snarl, bearing long, sharp teeth that glistened in the faint light. I felt frozen, every instinct screaming at me to run, but knowing that if I did, it would chase me down in seconds, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and vanished into the woods, its massive frame disappearing between the trees, leaving only the echo of its snarl behind. I stood there for a moment, breathing hard, trying to calm my racing heart. What the hell had I just seen? It couldn't have been a wolf, not standing like that, not moving like that. I'd seen wolves before. This was different. I slowly lowered my flashlight and backed toward the truck, my eyes scanning the edge of the forest for any sign of the creature. It was gone, for now. Once inside the truck, I locked the doors, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I started the engine and turned the headlights on, flooding the clearing with light. Nothing. Just trees and shadows. My radio crackled to life, and dispatcher's voice came through, distorted but clear enough. "You check out that noise, Ranger." I hesitated, unsure of what to even say. "Yeah," I replied finally, my voice tight. "There's something out here. I'm not sure what, but it's big." There was a pause on the other end. And then, big, like a bear. I glanced back at the barn, at the darkness that seemed to press in on all sides. "No," I said quietly. "Not a bear." The ride back felt like it took hours, my eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing barreling down the road behind me, but the forest stayed quiet, unnaturally so, as if the entire world had gone still, waiting for something. When I finally reached the station, I sat in the truck for a long time, replaying the events of the night in my head, trying to make sense of what I had seen. My mind kept coming back to those eyes, the way they glowed in the darkness, the intelligence behind them. This wasn't just some wild animal. I filed the report, leaving out the details that would make me sound crazy. "Possible large predator near Levington property," I wrote. "Recommend further investigation." But even as I wrote it, I knew I wouldn't be the one to go back out there, not after what I'd seen. In the days that followed, I kept waiting for another call, for someone else to report strange noises or sightings out by the old farm, but there was nothing. The forest seemed to swallow the place whole, as if whatever lived out there had gone back into hiding, waiting for the right moment to show itself again. Weeks passed, and life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after something like that. But every time I drove through the forest, every time I heard the wind rustling through the trees or saw the shadows shift in the distance, I thought of those glowing eyes watching me from the edge of the woods, and I knew that whatever it was still out there. Story 8. The stench hit us first. A putrid, cloying odor that made my stomach churn and my eyes water. As we approached the clearing, the source of that unholy smell became clear, and with it, the realization that we were no longer the apex predators in these woods. My name's Jack Hawkins, and I've been hunting these forests for over 30 years. I thought I knew every inch of this land, every creature that called it home. But what we found that day, it changed everything. It was supposed to be a routine hunting trip. Me, my brother Tom, and our old friend Mike had been planning this weekend for months. We'd done it 100 times before. Head out to our favorite spot deep in the national forest, set up camp, and spend a few days tracking deer. The first day went smoothly enough. We hiked in, set up our tents, and did some light scouting. There were plenty of deer signs, tracks, droppings, the usual. We went to bed that night, feeling optimistic about the hunt ahead. It was just after dawn when we set out the next morning. The air was crisp, the forest still shrouded in mist. Perfect hunting weather. We split up, each taking a different section of the woods, agreeing to meet back at camp for lunch. I'd been walking for about an hour, moving quietly through the underbrush, when I first noticed something off. The forest had gone quiet. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals in the leaves. It was as if everything was holding its breath. That's when I smelled it. At first, just a faint whiff, but it grew stronger as I moved forward. It was like rotting meat, but with an underlying musk that I'd never encountered before. Every instinct told me to turn back, but curiosity pushed me on. I came upon the clearing suddenly. One moment I was pushing through thick brush, the next I was standing at the edge of an open space. And there, in the center, was the carcass. It took my brain a moment to process what I was seeing. It was a deer, or what was left of one. The body had been torn apart, not with the precision of a hunter's knife, but with savage, brutal force. Ribs were splayed open, organs scattered across the forest floor, but it was the head that truly chilled me. It was missing. Torn clean off. I've seen my share of animal kills. Bears, mountain lions, they can be messy eaters. But this was different. The violence here was beyond anything I'd ever encountered. As I stood there, trying to make sense of the scene, my eyes were drawn to the trees surrounding the clearing. That's when I saw the claw marks. They were everywhere, deep gouges in the bark, some as high as 10 feet off the ground. Whatever had done this was big, bigger than any bear I'd ever seen or heard of in these parts. I keyed my radio, my voice shaky as I called for Tom and Mike. Guys, you need to see this. I'm in a clearing about a mile northeast of camp. Follow the smell. They must have heard the urgency in my voice, because it wasn't long before I heard them crashing through the undergrowth. When they burst into the clearing, they stopped dead, just as I had. Jesus Christ, Tom whispered, his face pale. What the hell did this? Mike, always the most level-headed of us, moved closer to examine the carcass. This kill is fresh, he said, his voice tense. Can't be more than a few hours old. That's when it hit me. Whatever had done this could still be nearby. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, a primal fear taking hold. For the first time in decades, I felt like prey. We need to get out of here, I said, my hand tightening on my rifle. Now! Neither Tom nor Mike argued. We turned to leave, but Mike paused, his eyes fixed on something at the edge of the clearing. Guys, he said softly, look, there, pressed into a patch of soft earth, was a footprint, but not like any animal print I'd ever seen. It was huge, easily twice the size of my own boot, and it was wrong. The shape was almost human-like, but distorted, with long, curved claw marks at the end of each toe. We stood there, staring at that impossible print, the realization slowly sinking in. There was something out here, something that shouldn't exist, and we were in its hunting grounds. The snap of a branch shattered the silence. Our heads whipped around toward the sound. There, just beyond the tree line, something moved, something big. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of dark fur, of muscles rippling under a massive frame. Then it was gone, melting back into the shadows with a speed that defied its size. We ran. All pretense of being experienced outdoorsmen vanished in an instant. We crashed through the forest, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. The only thought in my mind was to get back to camp, to get to the car, to get the hell out of these woods. As we ran, I could hear something moving parallel to us, just out of sight. It was keeping pace, effortlessly, circling around, herding us. The realization that we were being hunted sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through my body. We burst into our campsite, gasping for air. "Grab what you can," I managed to choke out. "We're leaving, now." We stuffed our packs haphazardly, not bothering with the tents or most of our gear. All the while, I could feel eyes on us, watching from the shadows of the forest. The feeling of being prey had never been so palpable. Just as we were about to leave, a sound froze us in our tracks. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Not quite animal, not quite human. It spoke of ancient hunger and primal rage. We ran again, no longer caring about the noise we made. Our only goal was to reach the trailhead, to get to the car. Each snapping twig behind us, each rustle of leaves, sent a fresh spike of terror through my body. The trek that had taken us hours the day before we now covered in a fraction of the time. When we finally broke through the tree line and saw the parking lot, I could have wept with relief. We piled into the car, engines roaring to life. As we peeled out onto the road, I caught one last glimpse in the rearview mirror. There, at the edge of the forest, stood a figure, tall, muscular, covered in dark fur. For just a moment, our eyes met. The intelligence I saw there, coupled with the raw, animal hunger, would haunt my dreams for years to come. We drove in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. It wasn't until we were miles away, the forest far behind us, that Mike finally spoke. What do we do now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white. "I don't know," I admitted. "Who would believe us?" The truth was, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, felt that primal fear in my bones, I would have dismissed it as a campfire story, a legend. But I knew what we'd seen was real. The carcass, the claw marks, that footprint, they were burned into my memory, and those eyes. They had looked back at me with an intelligence that defied explanation. As we drove back to civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd stumbled upon something profound. A secret the forest had kept hidden for centuries. We had ventured into the domain of a creature that blurred the line between legend and reality, and we had barely escaped to tell the tale. I knew then that I could never look at the wilderness the same way again. The forest, once a place of comfort and familiarity, now held mysteries and dangers I'd never imagined. We had been reminded, in the most visceral way possible, that there are some parts of this world where humans are not meant to tread, and somewhere out there in the depths of the forest something was waiting, watching, hunting, a creature of myth made flesh, challenging everything we thought we knew about the natural world. As the lights of the town came into view, I made a silent vow. I would return to those woods someday, not to hunt, but to understand, because now I knew the truth that so many had dismissed as folklore. In the wildest parts of our world, legends still roam free, and we are not alone in the dark. Story 9. There's something deeply unsettling about waking up in the dead of night, knowing something is wrong before your mind fully catches up. That was the first thing that hit me, the stillness. Not the kind of quiet you expect in the wilderness, but the kind of unnatural silence that grips you by the throat and tells you to be afraid. It's the silence that tells you something's watching, something you can't see. I sat up in my sleeping bag, the nylon crinkling loudly in the suffocating hush of the tent. Next to me, Sarah stirred, but she didn't wake. Outside, the campfire had long since died down, leaving only the faint glow of embers visible through the thin fabric of the tent. My heart was pounding for no reason I could explain. Then the sound came, a low, guttural crack of wood breaking, somewhere just beyond the light of the embers. A branch. No, too loud. It wasn't the kind of sound the wind makes when it rustles through the trees. It was deliberate, heavy. Like something big was moving out there, something heavy enough to snap branches underfoot without care. I reached over and shook Sarah awake. She groaned softly, pulling her sleeping bag tighter around her before turning to me, her eyes squinting in the faint light. "What is it?" she mumbled, half asleep. "Shh," I whispered, my voice barely audible, my pulse quickening. "Listen." She sat up slowly, and for a few seconds the silence was all there was. Her sleepy expression faded as she registered the same eerie stillness I had. Then it came again, a deep crunch, followed by another snap. Something, or someone, was definitely out there. Sarah's eyes widened, her breath quickening as she glanced toward the tent flap. "Is it a bear?" she whispered, though I could hear the fear in her voice. We hadn't seen any signs of bears when we arrived, and this area wasn't exactly known for them, but that didn't mean we were alone out here. The wilderness has a way of hiding things. "I don't know," I whispered back. My heart pounded in my chest, and I reached instinctively for the flashlight next to my sleeping bag. My hand trembled as I clicked it on, the beam cutting through the fabric of the tent and casting long shadows across the floor. Whatever it wasn't far from our campsite now, too close for comfort. We listened, every sense on high alert. The sounds were slow, methodical, like something moving through the woods with purpose. But it didn't sound like a bear. I'd been camping enough times to know that bears make noise, but they don't move like this. This was different. It was deliberate. I flicked off the flashlight, not wanting to draw any attention to us. Sarah shot me a nervous glance, and I could see she was just as on edge as I was. Her hand gripped the fabric of her sleeping bag, knuckles white. The tension in the air was thick, like we were waiting for something to happen, something we couldn't stop. The silence stretched again, but this time it was worse. This time it felt like a weight pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I wanted to unzip the tent and peek out, but some primal instinct told me not to move, to stay still, to wait. And then I saw it. Through the mesh window of the tent, barely illuminated by the dying glow of the embers, a shadow moved. It was tall, taller than any man I'd ever seen. At first, it looked like just another tree in the dark, but then it moved again, slowly, deliberately, stepping closer to the edge of our camp. I stopped breathing. Sarah saw it too, her eyes going wide as she clamped a hand over her mouth to keep from gasping. The figure was massive, hunched slightly, its arms hanging low, almost touching the ground. My mind was struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a person, some kind of animal? But no, it was too big, too strange. It stood there just at the edge of the camp, watching us. I could feel its eyes on the tent, on us. The shadows shifted again, and I could see it more clearly now, covered in thick, matted fur, its silhouette barely distinguishable from the dark forest behind it. It stood on two legs, like a man, but its shape was all wrong, too broad, too tall. I felt Sarah trembling beside me. I wanted to reach out and comfort her, tell her everything would be okay, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the thing outside. My body felt frozen in place, paralyzed by fear and confusion. I had no idea what we were dealing with, but every instinct in my body told me we weren't safe. The creature took another step forward, moving with a strange, almost fluid grace despite its massive size. I could hear the faint crunch of the ground under its feet as it moved. Closer now, too close. Then, without warning, it let out a sound, a low, deep growl that seemed to rumble through the air, vibrating in my chest. It was a noise that no animal I'd ever heard could make. Not a bear, not a wolf. Something else, something I didn't want to name. My heart hammered against my ribcage as I fought to stay calm. Sarah gripped my arm tightly, her breath coming in shallow, terrified gasps. We both stayed perfectly still, hoping, praying that it would lose interest and move on. For what felt like an eternity, the creature just stood there, watching. I could see its glowing eyes now, reflecting the faint light from the embers. Two bright pinpricks in the darkness, staring right at us. It knew we were there. It knew, and it wasn't leaving. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and walked back into the trees. I didn't move. I barely dared to breathe as I listened to its footsteps retreat into the forest, the sound growing fainter and fainter until finally the night was silent again. For a long moment, neither of us moved. We just sat there in the dark, listening to the quiet, too afraid to speak, too afraid to even acknowledge what had just happened. My heart was still racing, the adrenaline pumping through my veins, making my hands shake uncontrollably. "Finally," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "What the hell was that?" I didn't have an answer. I didn't know. My mind was still trying to process what I'd seen, what we'd both seen. It didn't make sense. Nothing about this made sense. "We need to go," I whispered back, my voice shaking as much as my hands. "We can't stay here." She nodded, her eyes wide with fear, and together we began to pack up as quietly as we could. Every movement felt agonizingly slow, and every rustle of fabric or click of a zipper made me wince, expecting that thing to come crashing back through the trees at any moment. We shoved our gear into our packs, not bothering to roll up the sleeping bags or collapse the tent properly. We just needed to get out. I grabbed the flashlight again, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to draw any attention to us. Not out here, not now. Once we were packed, we crept out of the tent, our eyes darting toward the forest, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The fire was completely out now, leaving us in near total darkness. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like whatever was out there could see us, even though we couldn't see it. We started down the trail, moving as quickly and quietly as we could. Every crack of a twig underfoot made my heart race. Every gust of wind through the trees sounded like that growl, that deep, terrible growl that I could still hear in the back of my mind. The forest felt alive, like it was watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see those glowing eyes in the darkness, following us. But the trail remained empty, the trees still. We walked for what felt like hours, neither of us speaking, too afraid to break the fragile silence that had settled over the forest. Eventually, the first faint hints of dawn began to creep over the horizon, casting the trees in a pale, grey light. We made it back to the car, just as the sun was starting to rise. I threw my pack into the back seat, my hands still shaking as I fumbled with the keys. Sarah climbed in beside me, her face pale, her eyes still wide with fear. As I started the engine and we pulled away from the trailhead, I glanced back at the forest one last time. The trees stood tall and silent, bathed in the soft morning light, and for a moment I almost convinced myself that it had all been some kind of nightmare, a trick of the mind brought on by the darkness and isolation. But then I remembered those eyes. Those glowing, unblinking eyes watching us from the edge of the camp, and I knew that whatever was out there, it wasn't a nightmare. It was real, and it was still out there. Story 10. The moment it stepped into the headlights, I knew our lives would never be the same. In that split second, as our eyes locked with something that shouldn't exist, the line between reality and nightmare blurred forever. It was supposed to be a simple family road trip. My wife, Lisa, our 2 kids, Emma, 12, and Jake, 9, and I had decided to take the scenic route through the mountains on our way to visit my parents. We'd done this drive countless times before, always marveling at the beauty of the winding roads and dense forests. As night fell, a light drizzle started, making the roads slick and visibility poor. I slowed down, hands gripping the wheel a little tighter. Lisa had dozed off in the passenger seat, and the kids were engrossed in their tablets in the back. "Dad, how much longer?" Jake's voice piped up from the back seat. I glanced at the GPS. "About an hour, buddy. Try to get some sleep." That's when I saw it, a flash of movement at the edge of the road. I instinctively slowed down, thinking it might be a deer. But as our headlights swept across the figure, my breath caught in my throat. It was tall, impossibly tall. For a moment, my brain tried to make sense of what I was seeing, a bear standing on its hind legs. But no, this was bipedal, moving with a fluid grace that no bear could match. Covered in dark, matted fur, It turned its head towards our approaching car. Time seemed to slow down. I saw its eyes reflect our headlights, glowing an eerie yellow-green. Its face was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features, with a pronounced snout and what looked like sharp teeth gleaming in the dim light. In the span of a heartbeat, it loped across the road in front of us. I slammed on the brakes, the car fishtailing slightly on the wet asphalt. Lisa jerked awake with a startled cry. "What happened? Did we hit something?" she asked, panic edging her voice. I couldn't find the words to answer. My eyes were glued to the spot where the creature had disappeared into the woods on the other side of the road. "Dad!" Emma's voice came from the back, tinged with fear. "What was that?" I swallowed hard, trying to gather my thoughts. I'm not sure, honey. Probably just a deer. But I knew it wasn't a deer. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. Lisa was fully awake now, peering into the darkness outside. Should we call someone? "The police!" I shook my head, still trying to process what I'd seen and tell them that we saw something. A heavy silence fell over the car. I could feel the kids' eyes on me, looking for reassurance. But how could I reassure them when I was struggling to believe my own eyes? Slowly, cautiously, I eased my foot off the brake and started to accelerate. That's when the engine sputtered and died. "No, no, no," I muttered, turning the key. The engine whined but wouldn't catch. This can't be happening. Fear, cold and sharp, settled in my stomach. We were stranded on a dark mountain road, miles from the nearest town, with something out there that defied explanation. "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I'm going to take a look under the hood. Everyone stay in the car and lock the doors." Lisa grabbed my arm as I reached for the door handle. "Don't go out there," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I squeezed her hand. "It'll be okay. I'll be quick." The moment I stepped out of the car, the silence of the forest struck me. No crickets chirping, no rustling in the underbrush. It was as if the entire mountain was holding its breath. I popped the hood and peered inside, the beam of my flashlight revealing nothing obviously wrong. As I leaned in for a closer look, a twig snapped in the woods to my right. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I turned my head towards the sound. There, just at the edge of the trees, I saw it again. Two glowing eyes, set high off the ground, staring directly at me. I could make out the vague outline of its massive form, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. For a long moment, we stared at each other. I felt like a rabbit caught in the gaze of a wolf, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I knew I couldn't leave my family. A low, rumbling growl broke the silence. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite animal, not quite human. The sound sent shivers down my spine. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the creature. When my hand found the car door, I yanked it open and practically fell inside, slamming it shut behind me. "Start the car!" Lisa yelled, her voice high with panic. I turned the key, praying to whatever might be listening. The engine coughed once, twice, and then roared to life. I didn't hesitate. I threw the car into drive and floored the accelerator. We fishtailed on the wet road for a heart-stopping moment before the tires found purchase. As we sped away, I caught one last glimpse in the rearview mirror. The creature had stepped onto the road, its massive form illuminated by our taillights. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw it raise a hand, not a paw, but a hand with opposable thumbs, as if in farewell. We drove in tense silence, everyone too scared to speak. It wasn't until we saw the lights of a small town ahead that we collectively let out a breath we didn't know we'd been holding. I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, the cheerful neon sign a stark contrast to the terror we'd just experienced. What was that thing, Dad?" Emma asked, her voice small and frightened. I turned to face my family, seeing the fear and confusion in their eyes. How could I explain something I didn't understand myself? "I don't know, sweetheart," I admitted, "but we're safe now." As we sat in that bright diner, sipping hot chocolate and trying to calm our nerves, I couldn't shake the image of those glowing eyes, that impossible form. I knew that what we'd seen would change us forever. In the days and weeks that followed, we tried to make sense of our experience. We scoured the internet for similar sightings, read about local legends, even considered reporting it to the authorities. But every time we started to tell someone, the words felt hollow, unbelievable. We found a few blurry photos online that bore a striking resemblance to what we'd seen. Stories of hikers and campers encountering something large and unexplainable in the mountains. But nothing concrete, nothing that could validate our experience. The kids had nightmares for weeks. Lisa and I found ourselves jumping at shadows, always looking over our shoulders when we were outside at night. The world suddenly felt bigger, more mysterious, and infinitely more dangerous. But as time passed, something else began to emerge. A sense of wonder, of having glimpsed something truly extraordinary. We'd seen something that challenged everything we thought we knew about the world around us. We never took that mountain road again, but sometimes, on clear nights, I find myself looking out at the distant forests, wondering, is it still out there? Are there more like it? And what other secrets does the wilderness hold? I know that most people would dismiss our story as a hallucination, a trick of light and shadow on a dark mountain road, but I know what I saw, what we all saw. And I know that somewhere out there, in the deepest, wildest parts of the world, there are things that defy explanation. Our encounter lasted only moments, but it changed us forever. It opened our eyes to the possibility that the world is far stranger and more wonderful than we ever imagined. And while the fear never fully fades, it's tempered now by a sense of awe, because now we know the truth that so many dismiss as myth or legend. In the shadows of our modern world, in the places where wilderness still reigns, the impossible becomes possible. And sometimes, if you're lucky or unlucky enough, you might just catch a glimpse of it. As for me and my family, we'll never look at a dark forest the same way again, because we know that sometimes, just sometimes, the legends are real, and they're watching us from the shadows, as ancient and mysterious as the wilderness itself. Story 11. The moment the last ferry left the island, I felt it, an eerie stillness that settled over everything like a heavy blanket. The kind of silence that presses down on you, making you feel like you're the only person left in the world. That's how it was working at a remote lighthouse. Miles of open water in every direction, the wind howling endlessly, and nothing but the ocean to keep you company. But tonight, it was different. There was something else out there. The air had changed when the sun dipped below the horizon, the usual salty tang replaced by something I couldn't quite place. It was heavier, damp, almost like the taste of wet fur hanging in the breeze. I shrugged it off as just the natural way of things in this part of the world. You get all kinds of strange smells out here, where the land meets the sea, and I'd learned not to question it. I stepped outside the lighthouse tower into the cold night air. The wind whipped at my jacket, and the only sound was the rhythmic crashing of the waves against the rocks far below. My flashlight beam swept across the surrounding grounds as I made my routine rounds. Everything seemed normal, just the same weather-beaten stones, the same rugged coastline, and the same isolation I'd grown used to in the months I'd worked here. Except the birds. The seagulls, which usually circled the lighthouse, crying out incessantly, were gone. Not a single screech or flutter of wings. That's what first struck me as wrong. The gulls were always here, even at night, their silhouettes visible in the beam of the lighthouse as they wheeled and dove above the cliffs. But now there was nothing. The sky was empty, and the island felt abandoned. I stood still for a moment, letting the flashlight hang limply in my hand, listening to the absolute silence. No gulls, no distant hoot of an owl. Nothing. I rubbed my arms, trying to shake off the sense of unease creeping up my spine. The isolation had never bothered me before, but tonight it felt like the island itself was holding its breath. The radio in the tower crackled briefly before cutting to static. I cursed under my breath and made my way back inside. The lighthouse's equipment was old, and the radio cut out often, but something about it happening tonight, with everything else, sent a chill through me. I climbed the narrow spiral staircase back to the lantern room. The rotating beam of light swept across the dark waters, its endless cycle comforting in its monotony. But even with the light, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was too quiet. I settled into the small chair beside the window, staring out at the dark expanse of the ocean. There was nothing out there, just the endless black waves and the cold night sky. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tapped the radio again, hoping for a clearer signal, but all I got was static. The mainland was too far away for regular reception, but the faint hiss was normally a constant companion. Tonight, though, the silence between the bursts of static seemed almost deliberate, like something was blocking the signal. I grabbed the small binoculars from the shelf and peered out toward the coastline. The light from the lantern swept over the cliffs, illuminating the jagged rocks and the swirling mist. At first, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just the familiar sight of the ocean crashing against the shore, the rocks slick and black in the beam's brief glance. But then, the light passed over something, a shape, standing near the edge of the cliff. I froze, lowering the binoculars for a second, then raised them again, my heart beginning to race. The light had already moved on, but I knew what I'd seen. There was something standing there, something tall. I waited, staring through the binoculars, straining to catch the next sweep of the light. Seconds felt like hours as the beam slowly made its way back around. When it did, I saw it again. A figure, standing still, just at the edge of the cliff. It was too far away to make out any details, but I could tell it wasn't human. The shape was wrong. Too tall, too broad, and its posture was hunched, almost like it was leaning forward, watching me. I dropped the binoculars and rushed to the window, pressing my hands against the cold glass. The beam passed over the spot again, and this time the figure was gone. I backed away from the window, my breath quickening. My mind raced through possible explanations. Maybe it was an animal, a trick of the light, my eyes playing tricks on me. But I knew better. I'd seen it clearly, and it had been watching the lighthouse. I grabbed the flashlight from the desk and ran back down the stairs, the metal steps clanging beneath my boots. My pulse hammered in my ears, and a knot of dread tightened in my stomach. Whatever it was, I had to know. I couldn't sit up there in the tower, wondering what was out there in the dark, so I headed toward the cliffs. The cold wind hit me hard as I stepped outside, the flashlight beam cutting through the mist as I hurried toward the spot where I'd seen the figure. My boots crunched on the gravel, and the beam of light bobbed ahead of me, illuminating the rocks and the seaweed-strewn ground. When I reached the edge of the cliffs, I stopped, shining the light out into the darkness. Nothing, just the same empty coastline, the waves crashing far below, the mist swirling in the air, but the feeling of being watched remained, stronger than ever. I scanned the area with the flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. There were no footprints, no signs of movement. The ground was slick and uneven, but there was no evidence that anything had been standing here. Yet I knew what I had seen. Then, just as I was about to turn back, I heard it. A low, rumbling growl, so deep and guttural that I felt it in my chest before I even registered the sound. It came from somewhere behind me, near the edge of the trees that bordered the clearing. I swung the flashlight around, the beam shaking as I searched for the source of the noise. My breath caught in my throat as the light passed over something, just for a second, but enough to freeze me in place. A pair of eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness. Reflecting the light back at me, the creature stepped forward, just enough for me to see its outline in the beam. It was huge, taller than any man, its body covered in dark, matted fur. It walked on two legs, hunched forward, with long arms that hung almost to the ground. Its head was canine, like a wolf's, but much larger, with pointed ears and a long snout. And those eyes, those glowing eyes, were locked onto me, unblinking. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a rock as I tried to keep the flashlight steady. The creature didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, its breath visible in the cold night air. The low growl rumbled again, vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the thing standing in front of me. It was like every instinct in my body was screaming at me to stay still, to not provoke it. But I had to move. Slowly, I backed away, keeping the flashlight trained on the creature. It didn't follow, it just watched, those glowing eyes tracking my every step as I edged closer to the lighthouse. When I was finally far enough away, I turned and ran, my heart slamming against my ribs. I didn't stop until I was inside, slamming the heavy door behind me and locking it tight. My hands shook as I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. The radio crackled to life again, but this time there was no static, just silence, followed by a long, low growl that echoed through the room. I bolted up the stairs to the lantern room, locking every door behind me. I didn't care if it was irrational. Whatever was out there wasn't going to get inside, not if I could help it. I spent the rest of the night in the lantern room, the beam of light sweeping endlessly over the dark sea. Every time it passed over the cliffs, I found myself holding my breath, expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me. But the creature never came back. By the time dawn broke, the island seemed normal again. The birds returned, the wind carried the familiar salty tang of the ocean, and the oppressive stillness lifted. But I knew it was still out there, lurking just beyond the reach of the lighthouse's beam, waiting. And I knew it would be back. The island wasn't mine anymore. It never had been. It belonged to something else, something older, something that watched and waited in the darkness. And now I was part of its world. Story 12. The scream that echoed across the lake that night wasn't human. It wasn't any animal we recognized either. And as we huddled in our small boat, watching the tree line for movement, we realized we were no longer at the top of the food chain. My name's Mike, and I've been fishing these waters for over 30 years. I thought I knew every sound, every creature that called this remote lake home. But what we encountered that night shook me to my core and made me question everything I thought I knew about the wilderness. It was supposed to be a routine fishing trip. Me and my two buddies, Tom and Steve, had been planning this weekend getaway for months. We'd done it 100 times before, load up the boat, head out to our favorite spot on Lake Whisper, and spend a few days catching bass and swapping stories. The first day went smoothly enough. We set up camp on a small island near the center of the lake, our tents nestled among the pines. The fishing was good, the beer was cold, and as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, we felt like we had the whole world to ourselves. It was just after midnight when we heard it. We were sitting around the campfire, trading jokes and planning our strategy for the next day's fishing, when a sound cut through the night that made my blood run cold. It started as a low, guttural growl, almost too deep to hear, but it quickly rose in pitch, becoming a howl that was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a wolf, wasn't a cougar. It was something else entirely, something big. We all froze, our eyes meeting over the flickering firelight. "What the hell was that?" Tom whispered, his face pale in the orange glow. Before anyone could answer, we heard it again, closer this time, and it was answered by another call from the opposite shore. "We need to get out of here," Steve said, already standing and reaching for his rifle. I nodded, my mouth dry. "Now, let's get to the boat." We moved quickly, grabbing only what we could carry. As we pushed our small craft into the water, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The lake, usually so peaceful at night, now felt oppressive. The mist that had settled on the water seemed to swallow the beam of our flashlight, and every splash of our oars sounded impossibly loud in the stillness. We were about halfway across the lake when we heard it. A splash, too big to be a fish, too deliberate to be natural. Something had entered the water. "Row faster!" I hissed, my eyes straining to pierce the darkness behind us. That's when I saw it. A shape moving through the water with impossible speed. It was big, much bigger than any animal that should be in these waters. "There's something in the water," Tom yelled, his voice cracking with fear. We rowed harder, our muscles burning with the effort. The shore seemed impossibly far away, and I could hear whatever it was getting closer, the water churning behind us. Suddenly, something hit the boat from below, nearly capsizing us. We grabbed the sides, struggling to keep our balance. In that moment, illuminated by our wildly swinging flashlight beam, I caught a glimpse of our pursuer. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. A massive head broke the surface, covered in dark, sleek fur. But it wasn't the head of any animal I recognized. It was almost human-like, but distorted, with a pronounced snout and what looked like sharp teeth gleaming in the dim light. Our eyes met for a split second, and what I saw there chilled me to my core. There was intelligence in those eyes, and something more. Hunger. Ancient, primal hunger. It disappeared beneath the water again, and we took the opportunity to row with everything we had. My arms felt like lead, but fear drove me on. We hit the shore hard, the boat grinding against the pebbly beach. We didn't hesitate, leaping out and dragging the boat up onto land. Only when we were a good 20 feet from the water's edge did we stop to catch our breath. What was that thing?" Steve gasped, his eyes wild as he scanned the lake. I shook my head, still trying to process what I'd seen. "I don't know. I've never seen anything like it." We stood there, panting and shaking as the adrenaline slowly faded. The lake was calm now, no sign of the creature that had pursued us. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching. As the first light of dawn began to break, we made a decision. We needed to get out of here, back to civilization. We packed up what gear we had managed to grab in our hasty escape and started the long hike back to where we'd left our truck. The forest, which had always felt like a second home to me, now seemed alien and threatening. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made us jump. I couldn't shake the image of those eyes, that impossible form cutting through the water. It wasn't until we reached the parking lot, our truck a welcome sight of normality, that we began to relax. As we drove away, leaving the lake and its secrets behind, we tried to make sense of what had happened. "Maybe it was just a bear," Tom suggested half-heartedly. "In the dark, with the mist, we could have imagined, but we all knew that wasn't true. What we'd seen was no bear, no known animal. It was something else entirely." In the days and weeks that followed, we struggled with whether to report what we'd seen. Who would believe us? We scoured the internet for similar sightings, read about local legends, even considered going to the authorities. But every time we started to tell someone, the words felt hollow, unbelievable. We found a few blurry photos online that bore a striking resemblance to what we'd glimpsed. Stories of other anglers and campers encountering something large and unexplainable in remote lakes and rivers. But nothing concrete, nothing that could validate our experience. I had nightmares for weeks. I'd wake up in a cold sweat. The image of those intelligent, hungry eyes burned into my mind. I found myself jumping at shadows, always looking over my shoulder when I was near water, but as time passed, something else began to emerge. A sense of wonder, of having glimpsed something truly extraordinary. We'd seen something that challenged everything we thought we knew about the world around us. I never went back to Lake Whisper, but sometimes, on quiet nights, I find myself drawn to the water's edge, peering into the depths and wondering, is it still out there? Are there more like it? And what other secrets do the wild places of the world hold? I know that most people would dismiss our story as a hallucination, a trick of light and shadow on a dark lake, but I know what I saw, what we all saw, and I know that somewhere out there, in the deepest, wildest parts of the world, there are things that defy explanation. Our encounter lasted only minutes, but it changed us forever. It opened our eyes to the possibility that the world is far stranger and more wonderful than we ever imagined. And while the fear never fully fades, it's tempered now by a sense of awe, because now we know the truth that so many dismiss as myth or legend. In the shadows of our modern world, in the places where wilderness still reigns, the impossible becomes possible. And sometimes, if you're lucky or unlucky enough, you might just catch a glimpse of it. As for me, I'll never look at a dark body of water the same way again. Because I know that sometimes, just sometimes, the legends are real, and they're watching us from the depths, as ancient and mysterious as the wilderness itself. Story 13. There are some places in the wild that make you feel like you shouldn't be there, like you've stepped somewhere that doesn't belong to you. That was the feeling I got the moment we entered the valley. We had hiked off trail, miles away from the usual routes in the national park, the kind of place where only the most experienced trekkers ventured, the kind of place where nature still felt untouched, unbothered by the footsteps of people. But now, as the towering trees closed in around us and the wind died down, I felt like we were intruding, and something out there knew it. The three of us, me, Greg, and Josh, had set out that morning confident and prepared. We'd been planning this trip for weeks, eager to explore the lesser-known parts of the park. The idea was to find a remote valley we'd spotted on a map, one that had no official trails leading to it, just pure wilderness waiting to be explored. But by the time we actually arrived, the sun had already started its slow descent, casting long shadows over the rugged terrain. The valley itself was quiet, the air still in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Check this place out," Greg said, his voice too loud in the heavy silence. "It's incredible. Feels like no one's been here in 100 years. I nodded, but something inside me twisted uncomfortably. It didn't feel like no one had been here. It felt like something had, and it didn't want us here. Josh dropped his pack onto the ground, oblivious to the weird tension that had settled over me. "This'll make a great campsite," he said, grinning. "Perfect spot for a fire, too." I glanced around, taking in the towering pines and the sheer cliffs that surrounded the valley like a natural fortress. It was beautiful, no doubt. But the silence. It wasn't right. No birds, no insects, not even the wind. Just an oppressive stillness, like the valley itself was holding its breath. "Yeah, great," I muttered, setting my pack down next to his. But my eyes kept drifting to the tree line, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We set up camp quickly, and as the last of the daylight disappeared, Greg and Josh started a fire. The flames crackled and popped, the light flickering across the darkening woods around us. The warmth helped, but it didn't banish the strange unease that gnawed at my gut. "Hey, did you guys notice how quiet it is out here?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Greg looked up from the fire, raising an eyebrow. "Quiet's good, man. That's why we came out here, remember? To get away from all the noise." I didn't press the issue, but I could tell Josh felt it too. He hadn't said much since we arrived, and he kept glancing into the trees like I had been, his usual laid-back attitude replaced with something more alert, more tense. The fire burned steadily, casting long shadows that danced across the ground. The night deepened, and we settled in around the flames, but that feeling of being watched never left me. In fact, it only grew stronger, like whatever was out there was waiting for the right moment. It started with a sound, a faint rustle, barely noticeable over the crackle of the fire. At first, I thought it was just the wind finally picking up, or maybe a deer moving through the underbrush. But then I realized there was no wind, and the sound wasn't coming from the direction of the trees. It was coming from behind us, from the direction of the cliffs. "Did you hear that?" Josh asked, his voice low, tense. Greg shrugged, poking at the fire with a stick. "It's probably just an animal." I frowned, turning toward the cliffs. The firelight didn't reach that far, but I could make out the faint outlines of jagged rocks and the shadows of trees clinging to the edge of the cliffs above us. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I tried to convince myself that Greg was right, that it was just an animal. But then the rustling came again, louder this time, more deliberate. Josh stood up, his eyes scanning the cliffs. "That's not a deer," he muttered. "Or a bear." I got to my feet too, grabbing the flashlight from my pack and flicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the base of the cliffs. Nothing, just rocks and trees, the same as before. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, just out of sight, watching us. "Maybe it's just a raccoon or something," Greg said, still sitting by the fire, though even he didn't sound convinced anymore. Josh shook his head, his jaw clenched. "No way. Whatever that is, it's big." I was about to say something when the sound came again, but this time it wasn't rustling. It was a deep, low growl, reverberating through the air like a distant rumble of thunder, the kind of growl that makes the hair on your arms stand up and your blood run cold. We all froze. "What the hell was that?" Greg whispered, finally getting to his feet. I swept the flashlight over the cliffs again, but this time my heart dropped into my stomach. There, halfway up the rock face, a figure stood in the shadows. It was massive, taller than any man, easily 7 feet if not more, with long, gangly limbs that seemed to blend into the darkness. It was crouched slightly, its posture unnatural, like it was ready to spring. I blinked, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a person? An animal? But no, it was too tall, too broad, and its eyes were glowing, reflecting the light of my flashlight like an animal's in the dark. "Do you see that?" I whispered, barely able to get the words out. Greg and Josh turned to look, and I heard their sharp intakes of breath. "What the hell is that?" Greg whispered, his voice shaking. We stood there, frozen, staring at the figure. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching us from the cliffs, its glowing eyes locked onto ours. "We need to go," Josh said, his voice trembling. "Now?" Greg nodded, backing away slowly. Yeah, let's get the hell out of here." We moved quickly, grabbing our packs and stomping out the fire with shaking hands. The figure hadn't moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for the right moment to strike. As we hurried to gather our gear, the growling started again, low and deep, sending vibrations through the ground beneath our feet. My heart raced, and I fumbled with the straps of my pack, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely buckle them. "Come on, let's go," Josh urged, his voice barely above a whisper. We didn't need to be told twice. We slung our packs over our shoulders and began making our way back through the valley, moving as quickly as we could without breaking into a full sprint. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure following us, but it didn't. Not yet. The silence of the valley was oppressive as we moved, broken only by the sound of our boots crunching on the ground and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The glow of the fire had faded behind us, leaving us in near total darkness, with only the thin beams of our flashlights to guide the way. I could still feel it, though, that thing's eyes on us, watching. After what felt like hours, we finally reached the tree line at the edge of the valley. The forest seemed darker than before, more hostile, but it also felt like safety, like the trees would somehow protect us from whatever was out there. But just as we crossed into the forest, I heard it, the sound of heavy footsteps coming from the valley behind us. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. I didn't look back. None of us did. We ran. Branches whipped at my face, and the ground was uneven beneath my feet, but I didn't care. I just kept running, the sound of those footsteps growing louder behind us, relentless. Whatever that thing was, it was coming for us. We didn't stop until we reached the main trail again, our chests heaving, our bodies slick with sweat despite the cold night air. The footsteps had stopped somewhere back in the trees, but none of us dared to slow down. By the time we reached the truck, my legs were shaking so badly I could barely climb inside. Josh slammed the door shut behind him, his hands still trembling as he fumbled with the keys. We didn't talk as we drove away. There was nothing to say. We had come to the valley looking for adventure, and we had found something else, something that shouldn't have been there, something that still was. As the truck rumbled down the road, the silence in the cab was thick. But no matter how far we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that those glowing eyes were still watching, waiting for the next time we stepped too far off the trail. Story 14. The first time I saw the carcass, I thought it was just a coyote kill. By the third mutilated cow, I knew we were dealing with something far more dangerous and far less natural. My name's John Hawkins, and I've been working as a ranch hand in these parts for nigh on 20 years. I've seen my fair share of predator attacks, coyotes, mountain lions, even the occasional bear, but nothing could have prepared me for what we encountered that summer. It all started on a crisp morning in early June. I was out checking the fences on the east pasture when I came across the first body. At first glance, it looked like a typical predator kill. The cow was on its side, its belly torn open. But as I got closer, I noticed something odd. The cuts were too clean, too precise, and there was hardly any blood on the ground. I radioed back to the main house, and within an hour, the boss, Mr. Thompson, he was out there with me. He frowned as he examined the carcass, his weathered face creased with concern. "What do you make of this, John?" he asked, gesturing to the clean incisions. I shook my head. "Never seen anything like it, sir. No coyote or mountain lion I know of could do this." We called in the local wildlife officer, but he was just as baffled as we were. He took some samples, promised to run some tests, but I could tell by the look in his eyes that he was out of his depth. For the next few weeks, we were on high alert. We increased our patrols, set up more floodlights around the corrals, but it didn't help. 2 weeks after the first incident, we found another cow. This one was even stranger. It looked like surgical instruments had been used to remove specific organs. And again, there was that eerie lack of blood. By now, rumors were starting to spread through the nearby town. Some folks were talking about satanic cults, others about government experiments gone wrong. I didn't know what to think, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever was doing this wasn't natural. It was after the third kill that Mr. Thompson decided enough was enough. He asked me to stake out the north pasture, where we'd found the latest victim. I agreed, though a part of me was dreading what I might encounter. That night, I set up in an old hunting blind overlooking the pasture. The air was cool, a gentle breeze rustling through the grass. The moon was full, casting an eerie silver light over the land. I had my rifle across my lap and a thermos of strong coffee by my side. For hours, nothing happened. The cows grazed peacefully, occasionally lifting their heads to chew lazily. I was starting to think this was a waste of time when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the moonlight. But then it moved. It was big, much bigger than a man, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. It moved with an eerie grace, loping across the pasture on 2 legs. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it would give me away. I raised my rifle, peering through the scope, but what I saw made me lower it again in shock. The creature was covered in dark, matted fur. Its arms were long, hanging below its knees, ending in what looked like hands with sharp claws. But it was the face that really got me. It was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features, with a pronounced snout and gleaming teeth. I watched, paralyzed with a mixture of fear and fascination, as it approached one of the cows. The animal seemed oddly calm, as if under some kind of spell. The creature reached out with one of those horrifying hands and, with movements too quick and precise to follow, began its grisly work. I don't know how long I sat there, watching this impossible scene unfold. It could have been minutes or hours. But eventually, the creature finished. It stood up to its full height, and for a heart-stopping moment, it turned and looked directly at my hiding spot. Our eyes met, and what I saw there chilled me to my core. There was intelligence in those eyes, and something more, ancient, hungry. It was the look of a predator that had been hunting long before humans walked the earth. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, loping off into the darkness with inhuman speed. I sat in that blind until dawn, my rifle clutched to my chest, jumping at every sound. When the first rays of sunlight finally broke over the horizon, I made my way down to the pasture on shaky legs. The scene was just as gruesome as I'd expected. The cow lay on its side, organs removed with surgical precision. But now there was something else, a set of footprints leading away from the carcass. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own boots, with clear impressions of long, curved claws. I reported what I'd seen to Mr. Thompson, though I left out some of the more unbelievable details. He listened gravely, his face growing more concerned with each word. "John," he said finally, "I think we need to bring in some outside help." Within days, a team of what they called cryptozoologists arrived at the ranch. They set up cameras, took samples, and interviewed everyone on the property. I told them what I'd seen, every detail, and to their credit, they didn't laugh or dismiss me. For weeks, we waited. The attacks stopped as suddenly as they'd begun. The research team found some inconclusive evidence, strange hair samples, those huge footprints, but nothing definitive. Eventually, they packed up and left, promising to analyze their findings and get back to us. We never heard from them again. Life on the ranch slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after what we'd experienced. But things had changed. We all looked at the wilderness differently now, with a mixture of fear and awe. Every shadow in the forest could be hiding something unknown, something that challenged everything we thought we knew about the natural world. I stayed on at the ranch, but I never went out alone at night again. And I always kept my rifle close at hand, though deep down I knew it would be little use against what I'd seen. Years have passed since that summer, and I've never encountered the creature again. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full, I swear I can hear something moving out there in the darkness, something big, something hungry. I've thought long and hard about what I saw that night, tried to rationalize it, explain it away. But I know what I saw, and I know that somewhere out there in the wild places of the world, there are things that defy explanation. Most folks, if I told them this story, would dismiss it as the ramblings of an old ranch hand. A tall tale spun around a campfire, but I know the truth, and I know that the line between legend and reality is far thinner than most people realize. So if you ever find yourself out in the wilderness, in those deep, dark places where civilization is just a distant memory, remember this: we are not alone, and we are not always the top of the food chain, because sometimes, just sometimes, the monsters are real. They're out there, watching from the shadows, as ancient and mysterious as the wilderness itself, and all we can do is hope that our paths don't cross in the dark of night. As for me, I'll keep working this land, keeping a watchful eye on the herds, but I'll never forget what I saw that night. It changed me, opened my eyes to a world far stranger and more dangerous than I ever imagined. And every time I look out at those dark forests, I'll remember, and I'll wonder, what else is out there waiting to be discovered? What other secrets does the wilderness hold? And when will it decide to reveal itself to us again? Story 15. There's a kind of stillness in the woods that hits you differently in the winter. It's not the quiet you get on a summer afternoon, with birds chirping and leaves rustling in the breeze. No, this kind of silence is thick, heavy, and absolute. It presses down on you, settling deep in your bones. Out there, in the cold, white nothingness, you realize how alone you are. And I knew, as I trudged through the snow with my rifle slung over my shoulder, that something was wrong. I had been hunting these woods my whole life. Winter hunting was never easy, especially up in the north, where the snow piles up faster than you can track anything. But this time, something felt off from the moment I left the cabin. The woods were too still, too quiet. Even the animals had disappeared, leaving nothing but a blanket of snow, undisturbed as far as the eye could see. No tracks, no rustling in the bushes, just the echo of my own footsteps crunching through the snow. The sky was overcast, the kind of grey that makes it hard to tell what time of day it is, and the cold had a sharpness to it that bit into my face. I'd been walking for hours, following nothing in particular, just letting the forest guide me. I was looking for signs of deer, but there was nothing, not even a rabbit track. I stopped for a moment, pulling down my scarf and letting the icy air hit my face. The rifle in my hand felt heavier than usual, and I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that gnawed at my gut. I'd been out in the woods countless times, but this was different. It felt like the whole forest was watching me, waiting. Then I heard it, faint at first, a distant, almost imperceptible noise, carried on the wind. It was high-pitched, like a whistle or a cry, but not quite either. It was more like something in between. I paused, my breath hanging in the air, straining my ears. The sound came again, a little louder this time, and my heart started to race. It was coming from deeper in the woods. I scanned the trees, my gloved hand tightening around the stock of my rifle. I couldn't tell what direction it was coming from, just that it was out there, somewhere beyond the tree line. It wasn't a human sound. It didn't belong to any animal I knew of either. And I knew these woods. I stood there, listening, feeling the cold creep deeper into my limbs. The sound came again, and this time it sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't just the cold. There was something wrong about it, something that made my instincts scream to turn back, but I didn't. Instead, I did what I always do when something doesn't sit right. I pushed forward. I started walking again, this time more cautiously, my eyes scanning the trees for movement. My breath came out in sharp clouds, and the snow crunched loudly underfoot, breaking the unnatural silence. The further I walked, the louder the sound became. It was like a distant wail, rising and falling with the wind, and it was pulling me deeper into the woods. I don't know how long I walked on, but eventually I found something. Tracks. They were half buried in the snow, but they were there, big tracks. At first, I thought they were from a bear, but as I knelt down to examine them, my stomach dropped. The prints were too long, too narrow. The toes were spread out, almost like fingers, and the claws, they dug deep into the snow, like something heavy had passed through here. My breath hitched as I traced the outline of the print. Whatever had made this wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. A cold dread settled over me, heavier than the chill in the air. The sound came again, louder now, like it was coming from just beyond the ridge ahead. I stood up slowly, my rifle at the ready, and started toward the sound, even though every instinct in my body told me to turn around. I reached the top of the ridge and froze. Below me, in a small clearing, was the source of the tracks. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. It was crouched down in the snow, its massive body hunched over something. It was huge, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, with long, spindly limbs and fur matted with snow. Its back was to me, but I could see the way its shoulders heaved with each breath. It was eating. I could hear the wet, crunching sound of bones breaking. For a moment, I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. The thing, it wasn't human, and it wasn't an animal either. Its body was too twisted, too unnatural, like something that didn't belong in this world. My heart pounded in my chest, my pulse deafening in my ears. Then, as if it sensed me watching, it stopped. Slowly, it lifted its head, and I saw its face. The thing's skin was pale, almost white, like it had never seen sunlight. Its eyes were sunken, glowing faintly in the dim light. And its mouth, it was too wide, filled with sharp, jagged teeth dripping with blood. The creature turned its head toward me, sniffing the air, and for a second our eyes locked. I felt ice in my veins. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I just stood there, frozen, as the thing watched me. Then it let out a sound, a long, wailing cry that echoed through the trees, the same sound I had been hearing all day. It rose into the air, higher and higher, until it was almost deafening. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest, the rifle shaking in my hands. The creature stood up, its long limbs unfolding as it rose to its full height. It towered over the clearing, its head nearly brushing the low-hanging branches of the trees. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then, without warning, it took a step toward me. I fired. The sound of the shot cracked through the air, shattering the silence. The creature recoiled, a guttural snarl ripping from its throat, but it didn't go down. It just stood there, blood seeping from its side, staring at me with those glowing eyes. I turned and ran. I don't remember much of the sprint back. The trees blurred together, the snow flying up in clouds as I tore through the woods, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear it behind me, the sound of its heavy footsteps pounding through the snow, but I didn't dare look back. I just ran. By the time I reached the cabin, I was drenched in sweat, my legs burning with exhaustion. I slammed the door behind me and collapsed against it, my chest heaving. For a long time, I just sat there, listening, waiting, but there was nothing, no sound, no footsteps, just the eerie silence of the winter woods. I stayed in that cabin for 2 more days, not daring to leave, not daring to step outside. Every time the wind howled, I flinched, expecting to hear that wail again, but it never came. The creature, whatever it was, didn't follow me. But I knew it was still out there, somewhere in the snow-covered woods. It was waiting, and I knew I'd never hunt those woods again. Story 16. The wind howled like a wounded beast, but it wasn't the storm that made my blood run cold. It was the massive footprints in the fresh snow, leading right up to our tent. My name is Sarah Chen, and I've been an avid mountaineer for over a decade. I've scaled peaks on 5 continents, faced blizzards, avalanches, and treacherous ice fields. But nothing in my experience could have prepared me for what we encountered on Mount Silverpine that fateful night. Our team of 4 had set out to tackle Silverpine's notoriously difficult north face. There was me, our lead climber Jake, our navigator Mike, and our rookie Liam. We were all experienced climbers, except for Liam, who was on his first major expedition. The first 2 days of our ascent had gone smoothly, the weather holding steady as we made our way up the mountain's unforgiving slopes. It was on the 3rd day that things started to go wrong. The weather forecast had predicted clear skies, but as we reached our planned campsite on a narrow ledge about halfway up the mountain, dark clouds began rolling in with alarming speed. "We need to set up camp now," Jake shouted over the rising wind. "Aye, this storm looks nasty." We worked quickly, securing our tent against the strengthening gusts. By the time we'd finished, the world around us had disappeared into a swirling white void. The temperature plummeted, and soon we were huddled in our sleeping bags, listening to the storm rage outside. That's when we heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on us. But then it came again, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very rock we were camped on. "What was that?" Liam asked, his eyes wide with fear. Mike shook his head. "Probably just the wind. These mountains can play tricks on your mind." But I wasn't so sure. In all my years of climbing, I'd never heard the wind make a sound quite like that. As the night wore on, the strange noises continued. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps, impossibly heavy, moving around our tent. Other times, it was that bone-chilling growl. We tried to convince ourselves it was just the storm, but deep down, we all knew something wasn't right. It was just before dawn, when the noises suddenly stopped. The storm had blown itself out, leaving behind an eerie silence. We emerged from our tent, blinking in the pale morning light. That's when we saw them. Footprints in the fresh snow, circling our tent. But these weren't human footprints. They were massive, easily twice the size of my own boot, with clear impressions of claws at the end of each toe. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, crouching down to examine one of the prints. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Guys, nothing makes tracks like this. Not up here." Mike was already pulling out his satellite phone. "We need to call this in, get some experts up here." But as he tried to dial, his face fell. No signal. The storm must have knocked out the satellite coverage. We stood there, staring at each other, the realization sinking in. We were alone on this mountain with something that shouldn't exist. "We should head back down," Liam said, his voice shaky. "Forget the climb." Part of me wanted to agree with him. But another part, the part that had driven me to climb mountains in the first place, was curious. What had made these tracks? What was out here that we didn't know about? Before we could decide, we heard it again. That low, rumbling growl, coming from somewhere above us. We all looked up simultaneously, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the light on the snow-covered rocks. But then it moved. It was big, much bigger than a man, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. It was covered in what looked like thick, dark fur, standing upright on 2 legs. For a moment, our eyes met. What I saw in those eyes made my blood run cold. There was intelligence there, and something else. Something ancient and wild. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, moving with surprising agility over the snow-covered rocks. We stood there in stunned silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Finally, Jake spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get off this mountain. Now." No one argued. We packed up camp in record time, our eyes constantly scanning the rocks around us. The descent was treacherous, our usual caution amplified by the fear of what might be lurking just out of sight. As we made our way down, we kept finding more of those massive footprints. Sometimes they paralleled our path. Other times they seemed to be circling around us. The feeling of being watched was constant and oppressive. It was late afternoon when we finally reached base camp. The team there was surprised to see us back so soon, and even more surprised by our story. They listened with growing concern as we recounted what we'd seen and heard. Within hours, a team of wildlife experts had been called in. They examined our photos of the footprints, listened to our descriptions of the creature we'd seen. They took samples, set up cameras on the mountain, but in the end, they found nothing conclusive. Some dismissed our story as a hallucination brought on by altitude and fear. Others suggested it might have been a bear, though none could explain the bipedal tracks or the size of the creature we'd seen. In the months that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened on that mountain. I scoured the internet for similar sightings, read about local legends, even reached out to cryptozoologists. I found stories of other climbers and hikers encountering something similar in remote mountain ranges around the world. But nothing concrete, nothing that could definitively prove what we'd seen. I never went back to Mount Silverpine, but I didn't stop climbing either. Instead, each new expedition became a chance to search, to maybe catch another glimpse of something that shouldn't exist. I know how it sounds. I know most people would dismiss our story as the product of overactive imaginations, of minds playing tricks in the thin mountain air. But I know what I saw, what we all saw. And I know that somewhere out there, in the highest, wildest places of the world, there are things that defy explanation. Our encounter lasted only moments, but it changed us forever. It opened our eyes to the possibility that the world is far stranger and more wonderful than we ever imagined, and while the fear never fully fades, it's tempered now by a sense of awe, because now we know the truth that so many dismiss as myth or legend. In the shadows of our modern world, in the places where wilderness still reigns, the impossible becomes possible, and sometimes, if you're lucky or unlucky enough, you might just catch a glimpse of it. As for me, I'll never look at a snow-covered peak the same way again, because I know that sometimes, just sometimes, the legends are real, and they're watching us from the heights, as ancient and mysterious as the mountains themselves. Every time I rope up for a climb now, I feel a mixture of excitement and trepidation. What will I see this time? What secrets do these remote places hold? And if I do encounter something unexplainable again, will I be ready? The mountains have always been a place of challenge and discovery for me, but now there's something more. They're a reminder that the world is bigger, wilder, and more mysterious than we can imagine, and that there are still frontiers out there, Still unknowns to be explored, so I keep climbing, keep searching, because now I know that the greatest discoveries aren't always at the summit. Sometimes they're in the shadows, in the unexplored corners of our world, and who knows, maybe one day I'll find the proof I'm looking for. Until then, I'll keep my eyes open, my mind ready for the unexpected, because in the end, that's what exploration is all about. Not just conquering peaks, but pushing the boundaries of what we know. And sometimes, those boundaries push back in ways we never expected. Story 17. I've spent 23 years as a forest ranger, and I thought I'd seen it all. But that night in the Cascade Mountains changed everything I thought I knew about the wilderness and what lurks in its shadows. It was a crisp autumn evening, the kind where your breath hangs in the air like a ghost. I was doing my final rounds before turning in for the night, checking the perimeter of the campgrounds to make sure all the visitors were settled and safe. The moon was full, casting an eerie silver glow over the pines, their shadows stretching like dark fingers across the forest floor. I remember thinking how quiet it was. Too quiet. Usually, you'd hear the chirp of crickets or the hoot of an owl, but that night, it was like the whole forest was holding its breath. That should have been my first warning. I was just about to head back to my cabin when I heard it. A low, guttural sound that sent chills racing down my spine. At first, I thought it might be a bear, but this was different. It was deeper, more human somehow, and it was close. My hand instinctively went to the tranquilizer gun at my hip. I'd never had to use it on anything bigger than an ornery raccoon, but tonight, I had a feeling that was about to change. I scanned the tree line, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. That's when I saw it. Just for a second, mind you, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. A massive figure, easily 7 feet tall, covered in what looked like dark fur. It moved with an eerie grace, loping between the trees on 2 legs before disappearing into the shadows. I'd like to say I was brave, that I immediately gave chase or radioed for backup. But the truth is, I froze. For a good 30 seconds, I just stood there, my heart pounding so loud I was sure whatever that thing was could hear it. When I finally got my wits about me, I did a quick sweep of the area. No sign of the creature, but I found something that made my skin crawl. Footprints, massive ones, easily twice the size of my own boots. They were deep, too, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. I took some photos with my phone, my hands shaking so bad I had to take each shot 3 times to get a clear image. Then I hightailed it back to my cabin, locking the door behind me and spending the rest of the night with every light on, jumping at every creak and groan of the old building. Morning came, and with it, a sense of doubt. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Maybe it was just a bear standing on its hind legs. Maybe the footprints were from some large hiker with custom-made boots. I almost managed to convince myself of these rational explanations. But then I went back to check the area in the daylight. The footprints were still there, even clearer now. And there was something else. Tufts of coarse, dark hair caught on the bark of a nearby tree. It wasn't bear fur. That much I knew. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. I collected samples, bagging them carefully. Part of me wanted to call in the discovery right away, to have a team of experts swarm the area and validate what I'd seen. But another part of me, the part that had spent years in these woods and thought I knew them like the back of my hand, hesitated. What if they didn't believe me? What if I was wrong? The thought of becoming the laughingstock of the ranger service, known as the guy who cried Bigfoot, held me back, so I kept it to myself, at least for the time being. I told myself I'd gather more evidence, make sure I had a rock-solid case before going public. But deep down, I think I was just scared of what it might mean if what I saw was real. The next few weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and paranoid days. Every shadow in the forest seemed to move. Every snapping twig made me jump. I found myself carrying my tranquilizer gun even on routine patrols, something I'd never done before. I scoured the internet for information, reading every account of Bigfoot sightings I could find. Some seemed credible, others were clearly hoaxes, but none of them quite matched what I'd seen. The creature I encountered seemed different, more menacing somehow. I started setting up trail cameras in the area where I'd had my encounter. Most of the time, they just captured deer or the occasional curious bear, but one night, about 2 weeks after my initial sighting, I got something else. The image was blurry, taken at night, with infrared. But you could clearly make out a large, bipedal figure moving through the frame. It was hunched over, its arms hanging long at its sides. The face was mostly obscured, but I could see the glint of eyes reflecting the camera's flash. I must have stared at that image for hours, trying to convince myself it was just a person in a suit, but the proportions were all wrong. The way it moved was unnatural. I knew, deep in my gut, that this was the same creature I'd seen that night. That's when the nightmares started. Every night, I'd dream of being chased through the forest by something I couldn't quite see. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of heavy breathing seemingly still echoing in my ears. I started to notice changes in the forest, too. Areas where the underbrush had been trampled, trees with bark stripped away high up their trunks. And the animals were acting strange. Deer seemed skittish, bolting at the slightest sound. Even the bears, usually bold enough to raid campgrounds for food, were staying deep in the woods. It was like the whole ecosystem was off balance, thrown into chaos by the presence of something that shouldn't be there. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit on this information, not when there were campers and hikers potentially at risk. But every time I picked up the phone to call my superiors, I hesitated. What if they didn't believe me? What if they thought I was crazy? In the end, it was an encounter with a group of hikers that forced my hand. They came into my station one morning, wide-eyed and pale. They told me about strange noises they'd heard in the night, about feeling watched as they made their way through the trails. One of them swore he saw a large, hair-covered arm reach out from behind a tree. I showed them the footprint photos and the blurry trail cam image. Their reactions ranged from fascination to outright fear. One of them, a wildlife biology student, asked if she could take some measurements of the prints. As they left, promising to keep quiet about what they'd seen for now, I knew I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. Whatever was out there, people needed to know about it. I spent that night compiling all the evidence I had, the photos, the hair samples, my detailed account of what I'd seen. In the morning, I was going to call in every expert I could think of. Cryptozoologists, biologists, even law enforcement. Someone had to be able to make sense of this. But as I sat there at my desk, the hairs on the back of my neck suddenly stood up. I had the overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. Slowly, I turned to look out the window. There, just at the edge of the clearing where my cabin stood, was a dark figure. It was partially obscured by the trees, but I could make out its massive shoulders, its long arms, and its eyes, reflecting the light from my cabin, staring directly at me. For a long moment, we just looked at each other. I felt like prey being sized up by a predator. Then, with a grace that belied its size, it turned and melted back into the forest. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the spot where it had been. My mind was racing, trying to process what I'd just seen. One thing was clear, though. This wasn't just about gathering evidence anymore. This was about survival. Whatever that creature was, it knew I had seen it. It knew I was a threat to its secrecy, and now it was watching me. As the first light of dawn broke over the trees, I made my decision. I couldn't wait any longer. I picked up my satellite phone and dialed the regional office. When the sleepy voice on the other end answered, I took a deep breath. "This is Ranger Mike Callahan at Cascade Station," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I need to report a Code 9. You're not going to believe this, but I think we have a Bigfoot situation." The silence on the other end was deafening, but as I started to recount my story, I knew that nothing in these woods would ever be the same again. Whatever happened next, the secret was out. And somewhere in the forest, I knew those eyes were still watching, waiting to see what I would do next. Story 18. I've been an avid camper for over a decade, but nothing could have prepared me for that night in the Adirondacks. It was supposed to be a routine weekend trip, a chance to escape the city and clear my head. Instead, it became the most terrifying experience of my life. The day had started perfectly. My friends, Sarah and Mike, and I had found an ideal spot, far from the designated campgrounds. We wanted solitude, a true wilderness experience. As we set up our tents in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, the air was filled with the sweet scent of pine needles and the promise of adventure. We spent the afternoon hiking, marveling at the vibrant fall colors and the crisp mountain air. As dusk fell, we gathered around our campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The stars were just beginning to peek out from behind the clouds when we heard it. At first, it was just a distant howl, barely audible over the crackling of our fire. We paused our conversation, exchanging curious glances. "Probably just a coyote," Mike said with a shrug, but there was an edge to his voice that betrayed his uncertainty. The howl came again, closer this time, and distinctly different from any coyote I'd ever heard. It was deeper, more guttural, with an almost human quality that sent shivers down my spine. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "That's no coyote," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. We listened intently, the marshmallows forgotten on their sticks. The forest had gone eerily quiet, as if every creature was holding its breath. Then, from the opposite direction, another howl answered the first, and another, and another. "We should get in the tents," Mike said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Whatever they are, they're probably more afraid of us than we are of them." But as we hurriedly doused the fire and retreated to our tents, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were the ones who should be afraid, very afraid. Sleep was impossible. We lay in our sleeping bags, every sense on high alert. The howls continued through the night, sometimes distant, sometimes so close it felt like they were right outside our thin nylon walls. Occasionally, we'd hear the snap of a branch or the rustle of leaves, signs that something large was moving through the underbrush. I must have dozed off at some point, because I woke with a start to Sarah's muffled scream. "The food!" she hissed. "We forgot to hang the food bag." My blood ran cold. In our panic, we'd left our supplies, including all our food, in a pile near the now cold fire pit. If there were bears in the area, we'd essentially laid out a buffet for them. Mike unzipped the tentacrack, peering out into the darkness. "I don't see anything," he whispered. "Maybe if we're quick." His words were cut off by a loud crash, followed by the unmistakable sound of tearing fabric. Something was in our camp, and it had found our supplies. We huddled together in the tent, hardly daring to breathe. The sounds of destruction continued for what felt like hours. Occasionally, we'd hear low growls or snuffling noises, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. When silence finally fell, none of us moved for a long time. The first pale light of dawn was just beginning to filter through the trees when Mike finally worked up the courage to look outside. "Holy shit," he breathed. I crawled to the tent opening, my legs shaky beneath me. Our campsite looked like a war zone. The food bag was shredded, its contents strewn across the clearing. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. Deep claw marks scored the trees surrounding our camp, far higher than any bear could reach. And there, in the soft earth, were footprints. Massive footprints, easily twice the size of my own feet, with distinct toe marks that looked disturbingly human-like. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Now!" We packed up as quickly as we could, constantly scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. More than once, I caught glimpses of something large moving just at the edge of my vision, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. As we hiked back towards civilization, the forest felt different, hostile. The very air seemed thick with menace. We'd come seeking solitude, but now the weight of our isolation pressed down on us like a physical thing. It wasn't until we reached the ranger station that we began to feel safe again. The ranger on duty listened to our story with a mixture of concern and skepticism. "We get a lot of bear reports in this area," he said, "but these prints, I've never seen anything like this before." He called in a wildlife expert who took casts of the footprints and samples of fur we'd found caught on the bark of a tree. As we gave our statements, I couldn't help but notice the meaningful looks the rangers exchanged. They clearly knew more than they were letting on. In the days and weeks that followed, I obsessively researched what we might have encountered. Bigfoot, Wendigo, some unknown species. The more I read, the less certain I became. The one thing I knew for sure was that something was out there, something that defied conventional explanation. Sarah and Mike were eager to put the experience behind them, to rationalize it as an encounter with an unusually large bear or wolf, but I couldn't let it go. The howls, the footprints, the feeling of being stalked by something intelligent and dangerous, it all haunted my dreams. I found myself drawn back to the Adirondacks, driven by a mix of fear and fascination. I started taking solo camping trips, each time venturing a little deeper into the wilderness. I set up trail cameras, collected plaster casts of strange prints, and recorded the eerie nighttime sounds of the forest. Most of the time, I found nothing out of the ordinary, but occasionally I'd catch a glimpse of something that made my heart race. A shadow moving with impossible speed through the trees, eyes reflecting the beam of my flashlight, too high off the ground to belong to any known animal. Once, I even found my campsite systematically destroyed, with no tracks leading in or out. My obsession began to take over my life. I lost my job, my girlfriend left me, and my friends started to distance themselves, concerned about my mental state. But I couldn't stop. I knew there was something out there, something that challenged everything we thought we knew about the natural world. It's been 3 years since that first terrifying night in the woods. I'm writing this from a small cabin I've rented on the edge of the Adirondack wilderness. Tonight, as the sun sets and the forest comes alive with night sounds, I'll venture out again. My backpack is loaded with cameras, audio recorders, and other equipment. Maybe this time I'll find the proof I need. Maybe this time I'll come face to face with whatever it is that lurks in the shadows of these ancient woods. Part of me hopes I find nothing, that I can finally put this obsession to rest and return to my old life. But a bigger part of me, the part that still hears those howls in my dreams, hopes for a different outcome. Because if what I suspect is true, if there really are unknown creatures living in the wilderness of North America, then everything we think we know about our world is wrong. As I zip up my jacket and adjust my headlamp, I can't help but smile. The thrill of the unknown, the possibility of discovery, it's intoxicating. And even as fear tightens my chest, I step out into the gathering darkness, ready for whatever the night might bring. Because out there, in the depths of the forest, something is waiting, something is watching, and tonight, just maybe, I'll finally uncover the truth. Story 19. I've been a wildlife photographer for 20 years, but nothing in my career prepared me for what I captured in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. What began as a routine assignment became an obsession that would consume my life and challenge everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It was a crisp autumn morning when I set out into the dense woods of Olympic National Park. The assignment was simple: capture the beauty of the old-growth forest and its inhabitants for a nature magazine. I'd done dozens of shoots like this before, and I expected this one to be no different. As I hiked deeper into the forest, the towering cedars and spruce trees blocked out most of the sunlight, creating a mysterious, almost primeval atmosphere. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. I breathed it in deeply, feeling more alive with each step into the wilderness. I'd been walking for hours, stopping occasionally to photograph a particularly majestic tree or an interesting fungus, when I came across a small clearing. Something about it felt off. The underbrush was trampled in a way that didn't seem natural, and there were strange marks on some of the trees, not quite claw marks, but definitely not made by any animal I recognized. Intrigued, I set up my camera and decided to wait. Wildlife photography is often a game of patience, and I had a feeling something interesting might happen here. As the day wore on and the light began to fade, I was about to pack up when I heard it, a rustling in the underbrush, too heavy to be a deer or even a bear. I raised my camera, my heart pounding with anticipation. What happened next occurred so quickly that I'm still not sure I believe it. A large, dark figure burst from the trees on the far side of the clearing. It was upright, bipedal, and covered in what looked like dark fur. In the split second before it disappeared back into the forest, I managed to snap a single photo. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. My hands were shaking as I finally lowered the camera. What had I just seen? My mind raced through possibilities. A bear standing on its hind legs, an unusually large hiker in a fur coat. But deep down, I knew it was neither of these things. It wasn't until I got back to my cabin that night that I really looked at the photo I'd taken. On my small camera screen, it had just been a blur of motion. But now, blown up on my laptop, I could see details that made my blood run cold. The figure was definitely bipedal, with long arms that hung almost to its knees. Its body was covered in thick, dark hair, but the face was almost human-like, with deep-set eyes that seemed to stare right into the camera. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, and yet it was familiar in a way that sent shivers down my spine. I spent the rest of the night researching, poring over accounts of Bigfoot sightings and comparing them to what I'd seen. Some details matched, but others didn't quite fit. This creature seemed different somehow, more primal, more dangerous. I knew I should probably alert the park rangers or maybe even the media, but something held me back. I needed to be sure, to gather more evidence before I went public with this. And if I'm being honest, part of me was afraid of being labeled a crackpot, of ruining my professional reputation, and afraid of what might happen if I drew too much attention to whatever was out there in those woods. So I kept it to myself. I told my editor I needed more time for the assignment and headed back into the forest the next day. And the day after that, and the day after that, weeks turned into months. I became a ghost to my friends and family, consumed by my search for the creature. I set up motion-activated cameras throughout the area where I'd had my encounter. I collected hair samples and made casts of strange footprints I found. I spent countless nights in a blind, waiting and watching. Most of the time I came up empty-handed, but occasionally I'd catch glimpses of something, a shadow moving with impossible speed through the trees, eyes reflecting the moonlight, too high off the ground to be any known animal. Once, I even found one of my cameras torn apart, the memory card missing. Each of these incidents only fueled my obsession. I knew I was onto something big, something that could change our understanding of the natural world, but hard evidence remained frustratingly elusive. As my search dragged on, I began to notice changes in the forest. Areas that had once been teeming with wildlife were now eerily quiet. I'd find strange patterns of broken branches high up in the trees, or large areas where the underbrush had been flattened, as if something massive had bedded down there. And always, there was the feeling of being watched. It grew stronger with each passing day, until it was almost a physical sensation, a weight pressing down on me from all sides. My behavior became increasingly erratic. I'd stay out in the woods for days at a time, surviving on energy bars and creek water. When I did return to civilization, I was jumpy and paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder. I lost weight, my beard grew wild, and dark circles formed under my eyes from lack of sleep. My editor eventually fired me when I failed to produce any usable photos for months. My girlfriend left, unable to cope with my growing obsession. But I barely noticed these losses. My entire world had narrowed to the search for the creature. It was on one of my longest expeditions, nearly 6 months after my initial sighting, that things came to a head. I had ventured farther into the wilderness than ever before, following a series of strange tracks I'd discovered. As night fell, I made camp in a small hollow, surrounded by ancient trees that seemed to whisper with the wind. The forest was unnaturally quiet, not even the hoot of an owl to break the silence. I was just drifting off to sleep when I heard it, the snap of a branch, unnaturally loud in the stillness. My eyes flew open, every muscle in my body tensing. Slowly, carefully, I sat up and peered out of my tent. What I saw made my heart nearly stop. There, at the edge of my campsite, stood the creature. It was even larger than I remembered, its massive form silhouetted against the starry sky, and it was looking right at me. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. I could hear its heavy breathing, see the steam of its breath in the cool night air. Its eyes, reflecting the dim light of my dying campfire, seemed almost curious. Slowly, with trembling hands, I reached for my camera. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for. Just one clear shot. That's all I needed to prove to the world that I wasn't crazy, that there really was something out there. But as my fingers closed around the camera, the creature's demeanor changed. It let out a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. Then, with a speed that belied its size, it turned and vanished into the darkness. I sat there for the rest of the night, camera clutched to my chest, straining my eyes and ears for any sign of its return. But there was nothing. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I finally allowed myself to relax. That encounter was both a triumph and a devastating blow. I had seen the creature again, been close enough to smell its musky odor and hear its breathing. But once again I had failed to capture any concrete evidence. As I packed up my camp that morning, I realized something had changed. The feeling of being watched, which had been my constant companion for months, was gone. It was as if the creature, having satisfied its curiosity about me, had moved on. I'd like to say that was the end of it, that I packed up my obsession along with my camping gear and returned to normal life, but the truth is, I couldn't let it go. Even now, years later, I find myself drawn back to those woods. I've never had another encounter like that night, never again seen the creature so clearly, but sometimes, when I'm deep in the wilderness, I'll catch a glimpse of something moving just at the edge of my vision, or I'll wake in the night to the sound of that low, rumbling growl echoing through the trees, and I'll know that out there, somewhere in the vastness of the forest, something is watching. Something that defies explanation, that challenges everything we think we know about the world around us. The photo that started it all still sits on my desk, a blurry reminder of the day my life changed forever. And every time I look at it, I'm filled with a mixture of fear and exhilaration, because I know the truth. There are still mysteries out there, still things beyond our understanding, and someday, somehow, I'm going to prove it to the world. Story 20. I've been a hunter for most of my life, but nothing could have prepared me for what we encountered in that abandoned cabin. It was supposed to be a routine hunting trip, just me and my buddy Rick. Instead, it turned into a night of terror that still haunts my dreams. The day had started like any other hunting excursion. Rick and I had driven out to a remote area of the Ozarks, a place we'd heard was teeming with deer. The fall air was crisp, and the forest was a riot of red and gold leaves, perfect hunting weather. We'd been tracking a particularly large buck for hours, following its trail deeper into the woods than we'd ever gone before. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, we realized we'd strayed far off our planned route. "We should head back," I said, checking my GPS. "It's a good 2-hour hike to the truck." Rick nodded, but then pointed to something through the trees. "Wait, what's that?" I squinted in the fading light. There, nestled in a small clearing, was a cabin. It looked old and weathered, its windows dark and empty. "Might be a good place to spend the night," Rick suggested. "Better than trying to navigate these woods in the dark." I hesitated. Something about the cabin gave me an uneasy feeling, but the alternative was a long, potentially dangerous trek back to our vehicle. Finally, I nodded. As we approached the cabin, the unease in my gut grew stronger. The place looked like it hadn't been inhabited in years. The wooden steps creaked ominously under our weight, and the door hung slightly ajar, as if inviting us in. Inside, a thick layer of dust covered everything. There was a small kitchen area, a table with 2 chairs, and a stone fireplace. A ladder led up to a loft area, presumably for sleeping. "Home sweet home," Rick said with a nervous laugh, dropping his pack on the floor. I forced a smile, trying to shake off my growing sense of dread. "Let's get a fire going. It's going to be a cold night." We set about gathering firewood and making the cabin as comfortable as possible. As I worked, I couldn't help but notice strange details about the place. There were deep gouges in the wooden walls, too high up to have been made by any normal animal. And in one corner, I found a pile of bones. They looked old, but something about them made my skin crawl. Night fell quickly, and soon the only light came from our crackling fire. We ate a meager dinner of jerky and trail mix, the silence between us growing heavier by the minute. "You hear that?" Rick suddenly asked, cocking his head to one side. I listened intently. At first, all I could hear was the pop and hiss of the fire, but then, faintly, I caught it. A low, mournful howl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. "Probably just a coyote," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. Rick shook his head. "That's no coyote, man." The howl came again, closer this time. It was joined by another, then another. Soon, it seemed like we were surrounded by a chorus of unearthly wails. We looked at each other, fear evident in both our faces. Without a word, we both reached for our rifles. The howls continued through the night, sometimes fading into the distance, sometimes so close it felt like they were right outside the cabin walls. Sleep was impossible. We sat with our backs to the fire, guns trained on the door, jumping at every creak and groan of the old cabin. It was nearing dawn when we heard it, a heavy thud on the roof, followed by the sound of something large moving across the wooden shingles. "What the hell is that?" Rick whispered, his voice tight with fear. Before I could answer, there was a loud crash from the kitchen area. We spun around, rifles raised, to see a large, hairy arm reaching through the now broken window. Rick let out a strangled yell and fired. The arm withdrew quickly, accompanied by a roar of pain that shook the very foundations of the cabin. For a moment, there was silence. Then all hell broke loose. The door burst open, splintering off its hinges. Dark, hulking shapes began to pour into the cabin. In the flickering firelight, I caught glimpses of matted fur, long arms, and faces that were a nightmarish blend of human and animal features. We fired wildly, the sound of gunshots deafening in the small space. I saw one of the creatures go down, but there were more behind it, always more. "The loft!" I yelled to Rick over the chaos. "We need higher ground." We scrambled up the ladder, kicking it down behind us to buy a few precious seconds. From our new vantage point, we had a clear shot at anything trying to climb up after us. The creatures prowled below, growling and snapping. One particularly large one began to scale the wall, its claws leaving deep gouges in the wood. I took aim and fired, catching it square in the chest. It fell with a howl, crashing into the table below. For hours we held our position, firing at anything that tried to reach us. The cabin floor was littered with the bodies of the fallen creatures, their dark blood staining the wooden planks. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, the attacks became less frequent. The surviving creatures retreated, their howls fading into the distance. We waited for what felt like an eternity, guns trained on the cabin below, before we dared to move. Slowly, cautiously, we descended from the loft. The cabin was a war zone. Bullet holes peppered the walls, and the floor was slick with blood. The bodies of the creatures lay where they had fallen, already beginning to decompose at an alarming rate. Without a word, we gathered our gear and stumbled out into the morning light. The forest was quiet now, peaceful even, as if the night's horrors had been nothing but a bad dream. We hiked for hours, pushing ourselves to our limits in our desperation to get back to civilization. Neither of us spoke. What was there to say in the face of what we'd experienced? It wasn't until we reached Rick's truck that the reality of what had happened truly hit me. As we threw our gear into the back, I caught sight of my reflection in the window. My face was pale, my eyes wild. I looked like a man who had stared into the abyss and seen it stare back. "We can't tell anyone about this," Rick said suddenly, his voice hoarse. "They'll think we're crazy." I nodded slowly. He was right. Of course. Who would believe our tale of monsters in the woods? As we drove back to town, I couldn't shake the feeling that our ordeal wasn't over. Those creatures, whatever they were still out there, and now they knew about us. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to put that night behind me. I told myself it was just a bizarre encounter with some unknown animal species, or maybe even a hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew the truth. I'd seen something that night that defied explanation, something that shouldn't exist in our world of science and reason. I never went hunting again after that. The thought of being in those woods, especially at night, filled me with a primal terror I couldn't shake. Rick felt the same way. We drifted apart after that trip, both of us trying to forget what we'd seen. But sometimes, on dark nights when the wind howls outside my window, I find myself thinking about that cabin in the woods, and I wonder, with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity, what other secrets those ancient forests might be hiding. Because now I know the truth. There are things out there, in the wild places of the world, that we can't explain. Things that lurk in the shadows, waiting for unsuspecting travelers to stumble into their domain. And if you ever find yourself in a remote cabin, far from civilization, and you hear an unearthly howl echoing through the trees, run, run, and don't look back, because the monsters are real, and they're closer than you think. Story 21. I've been an avid hiker for years, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened in the Appalachian Mountains that stormy night. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trek with my friends, Sarah and Mike. Instead, it became a night of terror that would change our lives forever. The day had started promisingly enough. The three of us had set out early, eager to tackle a challenging new trail we'd heard about from fellow hikers. The weather was perfect, cool and crisp, with a light breeze that carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. As we climbed higher into the mountains, the scenery became increasingly breathtaking. Vast forests stretched out below us, a sea of green broken only by the occasional glint of a distant lake or river. We were in high spirits, joking and chatting as we made our way along the winding trail. It wasn't until mid-afternoon that we noticed the change in the weather. Dark clouds began to gather on the horizon, moving towards us with alarming speed. The wind picked up, carrying with it the distinct smell of rain. "Maybe we should turn back," Sarah suggested, eyeing the approaching storm warily. I shook my head. "We're more than halfway to the summit. It'll take just as long to go back as it will to finish the trail. Besides, there might be shelter up ahead." Mike agreed with me, and after a moment's hesitation, Sarah nodded. It was a decision we would come to regret. The storm hit us with a fury I'd never experienced before. The rain came down in sheets, driven horizontally by howling winds that threatened to knock us off our feet. Lightning split the sky, followed almost immediately by deafening crashes of thunder. We stumbled along the trail, which had quickly turned into a muddy, treacherous slope. Visibility was near zero, and I was beginning to fear we'd lost our way entirely when Mike suddenly shouted over the roar of the storm, "Look! A cave!" Through the curtain of rain, I could just make out a dark opening in the rocky face of the mountain. Without hesitation, we made a dash for it, relief flooding through me as we finally escaped the fury of the storm. As our eyes adjusted to the darkness, we found ourselves in a surprisingly large cavern. The air was cool and damp, with a musty smell that hinted at great age. Our voices echoed strangely off the walls, creating an unsettling effect. "Well, this is cozy," Mike joked, his voice strained with false cheer. Sarah was already digging through her backpack. "I've got some emergency candles. We should be able to see a bit better with those." As the flickering candlelight illuminated our shelter, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. There was something off about this cave, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. We set up a makeshift camp, spreading out our sleeping bags on the driest patch of ground we could find. The storm continued to rage outside, its fury somehow amplified by the cave's acoustics. As we sat huddled around our meager light source, sharing what little food we had, Sarah suddenly froze mid-bite. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her eyes wide. Mike and I exchanged glances. "Hear what?" I asked. "Shh! Listen." We fell silent, straining our ears. At first, all I could hear was the howling of the wind and the patter of rain, but then, faintly, I caught it. A low, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing. "It's probably just the wind," Mike said, but his voice lacked conviction. The sound grew louder, impossible to ignore now. It was definitely coming from deeper within the cave, a slow, steady inhale and exhale that sent chills down my spine. "Maybe we should move closer to the entrance," Sarah suggested, her voice trembling slightly. But as we gathered our things, ready to relocate, a gust of wind extinguished our candles, plunging us into total darkness. For a moment, we stood frozen, the pitch black pressing in on us from all sides. Then, from the depths of the cave, came a sound that turned my blood to ice. A low, rumbling growl, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving towards us. Panic took over. We scrambled towards where we thought the cave entrance was, stumbling over rocks and each other in our desperation to escape. But in the darkness, we quickly became disoriented. "Where's the exit?" Mike yelled, his voice echoing off the walls. "I don't know," I shouted back, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The breathing was getting closer, accompanied now by the sound of claws scraping against stone. Whatever was in here with us, it was big, and it was coming our way. In our frantic search for the exit, we must have taken a wrong turn, because suddenly the cave floor dropped away beneath our feet. We tumbled down a steep incline, rolling and sliding until we finally came to a stop in what felt like an even larger cavern. Bruised and disoriented, we huddled together in the darkness. The sound of breathing was all around us now, as if the very cave itself was alive. "What do we do?" Sarah whispered, her voice choked with fear. Before I could answer, a faint light caught my eye. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but as I stared, it grew brighter. It was coming from the walls of the cave, a soft, phosphorescent glow that slowly illuminated our surroundings. What I saw made me wish for the darkness again. The cavern was vast, its ceiling lost in shadows high above us. But it wasn't the size that terrified me, it was the walls. They were moving, pulsing with a slow, steady rhythm that matched the breathing we'd been hearing. And then I saw them, eyes, dozens, maybe hundreds of them, glowing in the bioluminescent light. They lined the walls, the ceiling, peering at us from crevices and holes I hadn't noticed before. A scream caught in my throat as the reality of our situation hit me. We weren't in a cave. We were inside something alive. As if triggered by our realization, the creature, for lack of a better word, began to move. The floor beneath us shifted, and a deafening roar filled the air, shaking loose rocks and dust from above. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Sarah and Mike by their arms and pulling them towards what looked like a tunnel. We ran blindly, slipping and sliding on the moist, organic surface beneath our feet. Behind us, I could hear the sound of pursuit, a thunderous movement that seemed to shake the very mountain. The tunnel twisted and turned, branching off in multiple directions. We chose paths at random, driven by pure terror and the desperate need to find a way out. Just when I thought my legs would give out, we rounded a corner and saw it. A glimmer of natural light. The exit. With a final burst of speed, we sprinted towards freedom. I could feel hot breath on the back of my neck, hear the snapping of jaws just behind me. We burst out of the cave and into the rain-soaked night, tumbling down the mountainside in our haste to put distance between us and the horror we'd just escaped. It wasn't until we'd run for what felt like miles that we finally stopped, collapsing on the muddy ground, gasping for air. As the adrenaline wore off, the full impact of what we'd experienced hit us. We sat there in the rain, shaking and crying, unable to process the impossible thing we'd encountered. The rest of that night is a blur in my memory. Somehow, we made our way back to civilization, stumbling into a ranger station just as dawn was breaking. We told them we'd gotten lost in the storm, but we kept the full truth to ourselves. Who would believe us anyway? In the days and weeks that followed, we tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was a shared hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion. Maybe we'd stumbled into some secret military experiment, but deep down, we knew the truth. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the dark places where humans rarely venture. And sometimes, if you're unlucky, you might just stumble upon them. I never went hiking again after that night. The thought of being in the wilderness, especially in the mountains, fills me with a terror I can't shake. Sarah and Mike feel the same way. We don't talk about it much, but I know it haunts their dreams just as it does mine. Sometimes, on stormy nights when the wind howls outside my window, I find myself thinking about that cave. And I wonder, with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity, if it's still out there, waiting, breathing, hungry for its next unsuspecting victims. Because now I know the truth, the monsters aren't just real. They're bigger and more terrifying than we could ever imagine, and they're waiting in the places we least expect to find them. Story 22. I've been riding motorcycles for over 2 decades, but nothing in all my years on the road could have prepared me for what we encountered that day in the backwoods of Oregon. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip, just me and my riding buddies exploring some new trails. Instead, it turned into a nightmare that still haunts me every time I kickstart my bike. The day had started perfectly. The weather was ideal for riding. Clear skies, a gentle breeze, and temperatures that kept us comfortable in our riding gear. There were 4 of us: me, Jake, Sarah, and Mike. We'd been planning this trip for months, eager to tackle the challenging terrain we'd heard about from other riders. We set out at dawn, the roar of our engines breaking the morning silence as we left the small town where we'd spent the night. The first few hours were exhilarating. We wound our way through dense forests, climbed steep hills, and splashed through shallow streams. The trail was everything we'd hoped for, challenging enough to keep us on our toes, but not so difficult that we couldn't enjoy the stunning scenery around us. It was mid-afternoon when we reached the part of the trail that would change everything. We'd just emerged from a particularly dense section of forest into a small clearing, when Jake, who was leading the group, suddenly braked hard. "What the hell?" I heard him mutter through our helmet comms. As I pulled up beside him, I saw what had caused his surprise. The trail ahead was completely blocked by fallen trees, and not just 1 or 2. It looked like dozens of massive trunks had come down, creating a tangled barrier that stretched as far as I could see in either direction. "This can't be natural," Sarah said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "It looks like someone deliberately blocked the trail." Mike, always the practical one, was already consulting the GPS on his bike. "The next turnoff isn't for another 15 miles. We'd have to backtrack for hours to find another route." We all knew what that meant. With the sun already starting to dip towards the horizon, backtracking wasn't really an option. We'd never make it back to civilization before nightfall. "Maybe we can find a way around," I suggested, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Let's split up and see if there's a gap we can get the bikes through." It seemed like a good plan at the time. Jake and Sarah went left, while Mike and I headed right, agreeing to stay within shouting distance of each other. As Mike and I pushed our way through the underbrush, the forest seemed to grow denser, the trees pressing in close on either side. The late afternoon light barely penetrated the thick canopy above, casting everything in a gloomy twilight. We'd been searching for about 20 minutes when we heard it, a sound that made us both freeze in our tracks. It was a low, rumbling growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating through the trees. Mike and I exchanged glances, our eyes wide behind our helmet visors. Without a word, we both turned and began making our way back to the clearing as quickly and quietly as we could. We were about halfway there when we heard Sarah scream. My heart leapt into my throat as we broke into a run, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth. We burst into the clearing to find Jake standing alone, his face pale with shock. "Where's Sarah?" I demanded, looking around wildly. Jake just shook his head, seemingly unable to speak. It was then that I noticed the deep gouges in the trunk of a nearby tree, gouges that looked disturbingly like claw marks. "We need to get out of here," Mike said, his voice tight with fear. "Now." But as we turned back to our bikes, we realized with growing horror that they were gone. All 4 motorcycles had vanished without a trace. "This isn't possible," I muttered, my mind reeling. "They were right here." Another growl echoed through the forest, closer this time. We could hear the sound of something large moving through the trees, branches snapping under its weight. "Run!" Jake finally found his voice, and we didn't need to be told twice. We took off down the trail, our heavy riding boots and gear slowing us down, but fear lending speed to our feet. Behind us, we could hear the creature, whatever it was, in pursuit. Its footfall shook the ground, and its roars sent birds scattering from the trees in panic. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs felt like lead. Just when I thought we couldn't go any further, we stumbled upon an old, dilapidated cabin, half hidden in the undergrowth. Without hesitation, we piled inside, slamming the door shut behind us. Mike and Jake quickly pushed a heavy old dresser in front of the door, while I frantically searched for anything we could use as a weapon. For a moment, there was silence. We stood there, gasping for breath, straining our ears for any sound of pursuit. Then, with a crash that shook the entire cabin, something slammed into the wall. We huddled together in the center of the room as the attack continued. The walls shuddered under the onslaught, dust and splinters raining down from the ceiling. Through a gap in the boarded-up windows, I caught a glimpse of our attacker, a massive, hair-covered arm ending in claws that looked like they could tear through steel. "What is that thing?" Sarah whimpered, her voice barely audible over the chaos. None of us had an answer. This was something outside the realm of our experience, something that shouldn't exist in our world of logic and reason. The attack seemed to last for hours, though it was probably only minutes. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost as terrifying as the noise had been. We waited, hardly daring to breathe, for what felt like an eternity. Finally, when it seemed the creature had truly gone, we began to relax slightly. "We need to find a way out of here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We can't stay in this cabin forever." As if in response to my words, we heard a new sound, the distant whop-whop-whop of helicopter blades. Hope surged through me. Someone had noticed we were missing. Help was on the way. We burst out of the cabin, waving our arms and shouting. The helicopter appeared over the treetops, its searchlight cutting through the gathering dusk. As we were lifted to safety, I couldn't help but look back at the forest below. For a moment, I thought I saw a large, dark shape moving among the trees, but then it was gone, leaving me to wonder if it had ever really been there at all. The official report said we had gotten lost and imagined the whole thing due to dehydration and exhaustion. Our bikes were found several miles away, apparently moved by some local kids playing a prank. Sarah's disappearance was chalked up to her wandering off and getting separated from the group. She was found 2 days later, dehydrated and confused, with no memory of what had happened to her. But we know the truth. We know what we saw that day in the woods. And we know that somewhere out there, in the wild places of the world, there are things that defy explanation, things that wait in the shadows, ready to remind us that we are not the masters of this world that we think we are. I still ride my motorcycle, but I stick to well-traveled roads now, and if I ever find my path blocked by fallen trees, well, I turn around and head home. Because some trails are better left unexplored, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. The woods are dark and deep, and they hold secrets that we can scarcely imagine. And sometimes, if you're very unlucky, you might just stumble upon one of those secrets. If you do, pray that you're faster, smarter, or just plain luckier than we were, because out there in the wilderness, there are monsters, and they're hungry. Story 23. I've been a wildlife guide for 15 years, but nothing in my career could have prepared me for what we encountered in the depths of Yellowstone that fateful day. It was supposed to be a routine bear-watching tour, a chance for tourists to glimpse the majestic grizzlies in their natural habitat. Instead, it became a nightmare that would forever change my understanding of the wilderness I thought I knew so well. The morning started like any other. I met my group of 6 eager tourists at the lodge, going through the usual safety briefing and expectations for the day. There was excitement in the air as we loaded up the van and headed out into the park. Little did we know that by nightfall, that excitement would turn to terror. We'd been out for a couple of hours, slowly making our way through a particularly picturesque valley. The tourists were in high spirits, cameras at the ready, hoping to catch a glimpse of Yellowstone's famous wildlife. We'd seen plenty of elk and even a couple of wolves in the distance, but the bears were being elusive. It was mid-afternoon when we stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. In a small clearing just off the trail, we found the remains of an elk, but this was no ordinary kill. The carcass had been torn apart with a savagery I'd never seen before, not even from the most aggressive grizzly. "Is this normal?" one of the tourists, a middle-aged woman named Karen, asked hesitantly. I tried to keep my voice steady as I replied, "Bears can be pretty messy eaters, but this is unusual." As I examined the carcass more closely, I noticed something that sent a shiver down my spine. The tracks around the kill site were like nothing I'd ever seen before. They were huge, far larger than any bear print I'd encountered, and the shape was all wrong. 5 toes instead of 4, with what looked like opposable thumbs. I was about to suggest we move on when I heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The tourists huddled closer together, their excitement now tinged with fear. "Maybe we should head back," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "It's getting late," and my words were cut off by a blood-curdling scream from the woods behind us. We all spun around, hearts pounding. Through the trees, I caught a glimpse of something large moving with incredible speed. It was there and gone in an instant, but the image was burned into my mind. A tall, hair-covered figure, moving on 2 legs. Panic set in. We ran back to the van, stumbling over roots and rocks in our haste. I could hear heavy footfalls behind us, branches snapping under the weight of our pursuer. We piled into the van, and I gunned the engine, tires spinning in the dirt as we took off down the narrow park road. In the rearview mirror, I saw a dark shape emerge from the tree line, standing upright and watching us go. As we sped back towards the lodge, my mind was racing. What had we just seen? It couldn't be a bear. The movement, the tracks, everything was wrong. But if not a bear, then what? I radioed ahead to the park rangers, trying to keep my voice steady as I reported what we'd encountered. They seemed skeptical, but promised to send out a team to investigate. Back at the lodge, the tourists were shaken but excited, already spinning tales about their Bigfoot encounter. I wished I could share their enthusiasm, but a deep sense of unease had settled over me. In all my years in these woods, I'd never encountered anything like this. The rangers arrived a short while later, and I gave them a detailed report of what we'd seen. They listened politely, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They promised to check out the site in the morning, but I could tell they weren't taking it seriously. That night, as I lay in bed unable to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd stumbled upon something that defied explanation. The image of that creature, moving with impossible speed through the forest, kept replaying in my mind. I must have dozed off eventually because I woke with a start to the sound of my phone ringing. It was Dave, one of the rangers I'd spoken to earlier. "You need to come down to the station," he said, his voice tense. "We found something." Heart pounding, I dressed quickly and drove to the ranger station. Dave met me at the door, his face pale. "We went out to the site you described," he said as he led me inside. "We found, well, you'd better see for yourself." In the center of the room was a table covered with a white sheet. With shaking hands, Dave pulled back the cloth to reveal a clump of coarse, dark hair and what looked like a large, curved claw. "We found these near the kill site," Dave explained. "The hair, it's not from any animal we've been able to identify. And the claw, Joe swears it looks almost human, but that's impossible, right?" I stared at the items on the table, a chill running down my spine. "What are you going to do?" I asked. Dave sighed heavily. "Officially, nothing. We can't report something we can't explain, but unofficially we're closing that section of the park, at least until we figure out what's going on." As I drove home that night, my mind was reeling. Everything I thought I knew about these woods, about the animals that called them home, had been thrown into question. What else was out there, hiding in the shadows of the wilderness? The next few weeks were a blur. The Park Service kept things quiet, but rumors began to spread. More sightings were reported, dark shapes moving through the trees, strange howls echoing in the night. The area where we'd had our encounter remained closed, with official explanations ranging from dangerous wildlife activity to environmental studies. I couldn't let it go. I found myself spending my free time researching cryptozoology, poring over accounts of Bigfoot sightings and other unexplained phenomena. The more I read, the more I became convinced that what we'd seen that day was real. Finally, unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, I decided to go back. I knew it was dangerous, possibly even foolish, but I had to know the truth. I set out at dawn, my backpack loaded with supplies and my camera ready to capture any evidence I might find. As I hiked deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Hours passed, and I found nothing unusual. I was about to give up and head back when I heard it, that same guttural growl we'd heard weeks before. My heart raced as I slowly turned around. There, at the edge of a small clearing, stood the creature. It was even more imposing up close, easily 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. Its face was a disturbing blend of human and ape-like features, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow with intelligence. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. I knew I should be terrified, but instead, I felt a strange sense of awe. This was a creature that shouldn't exist, a living myth standing right in front of me. Slowly, carefully, I raised my camera. The creature watched me, its head tilted slightly as if curious about what I was doing. I managed to snap a single photo before it turned and melted back into the forest, moving with that same impossible speed and grace I remembered from our first encounter. I stood there for a long time, my heart pounding, trying to process what had just happened. When I finally made my way back to civilization, I was both exhilarated and terrified. I had my proof, or did I? When I developed the photo, my heart sank. The image was blurry, indistinct. You could make out a large, dark shape among the trees, but it could easily be dismissed as a bear or even a trick of the light. I considered going public with my story, sharing the photo and my experiences, but in the end, I decided to keep it to myself. Who would believe me? And more importantly, did I want to expose this creature, whatever it was, to the world? So I've kept my secret. I still work as a guide in Yellowstone, but now I see the forest with new eyes. Every shadow holds the possibility of mystery. Every unexplained sound, a potential encounter with the unknown. And sometimes, when I'm deep in the woods and the light is fading, I think I catch a glimpse of something moving just at the edge of my vision. A reminder that the wilderness still holds secrets, and that there are some mysteries that may never be fully explained. The tourists still come, eager for their bear sightings. I give them what they want, the safe, sanitized version of nature, but I know the truth. Out there, in the deepest, wildest parts of the forest, something is waiting. Something that challenges everything we think we know about the natural world, and part of me hopes that it stays hidden, a living legend in a world that has all too few mysteries left. Story 24. I've been an avid fisherman for over 30 years, but nothing in all my time on the water could have prepared me for what we encountered that night on Lake Champlain. It was supposed to be a simple weekend fishing trip, just me and my old college buddy, Tom. Instead, it became a night of terror that still haunts my dreams and makes me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. The day had started perfectly. We'd launched Tom's small fishing boat just as the sun was rising, the lake shrouded in a light mist that promised to burn off into a beautiful day. The air was crisp with the first hints of autumn, and the lake was like glass, disturbed only by the occasional jump of a fish. We'd been having pretty good luck, catching a decent number of bass and even a couple of nice-sized pike. As the day wore on, we found ourselves drifting further and further from shore, following the fish into deeper waters. It was late afternoon when Tom suggested we stay out after dark. "Night fishing," he said with a grin. "That's when the big ones come out to play." I was hesitant at first. There was something about the lake at night that had always made me uneasy, but Tom was persistent, and I eventually agreed. After all, what was the worst that could happen? As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, we anchored in a small cove that Tom swore was a hot spot for nocturnal fish. The temperature dropped rapidly as darkness fell, and soon we were huddled in our jackets, sipping hot coffee from a thermos and watching our lines. The night was eerily still. No wind, no waves, just the occasional splash of a fish and the gentle creaking of the boat. The moon was full, casting a silvery glow over the water that created strange, shifting shadows. We'd been sitting in silence for about an hour when Tom suddenly stiffened. "Did you see that?" he whispered, pointing towards the center of the lake. I squinted in the direction he was indicating, but saw nothing but moonlit water. "See what? I could have sworn I saw something break the surface out there, something big." I was about to dismiss it as a trick of the light when I saw it too. Just for a second, a large, dark shape breached the surface of the lake before disappearing back into the depths. It was too big to be a fish, at least any fish I'd ever seen in these waters. "Probably just a log or something," I said, trying to convince myself as much as Tom. But there was a gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach that told me this was something else entirely. We sat in tense silence for the next few minutes, both of us straining our eyes to catch another glimpse of whatever it was we'd seen. Then, without warning, something large bumped the bottom of the boat, nearly capsizing us. Tom let out a startled yell, grabbing onto the sides of the boat to steady himself. "What the hell was that?" Before I could answer, it happened again. This time, I caught a glimpse of something moving beneath the surface, something massive. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice tight with fear. I reached for the anchor line, ready to pull it up, when Tom's hand on my arm stopped me. "Look," he whispered, pointing towards the water. I followed his gaze, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There, just beneath the surface of the water, were two enormous eyes, glowing with an eerie bioluminescent light. They were easily the size of dinner plates, and they were staring directly at us. For a moment, we were frozen in terror, unable to move or even breathe. Then, as if sensing our fear, the creature began to rise. A massive head broke the surface of the water, followed by a long, serpentine neck. In the moonlight, I could make out scales glinting wetly, and rows of sharp teeth as the creature's mouth opened in what looked like a grin. Tom and I scrambled to opposite ends of the boat, our fishing rods forgotten. The creature, for I had no other word to describe it, circled us slowly, its eyes never leaving our huddled forms. "This isn't possible," Tom muttered, his voice shaking. "It can't be real." But it was real. As real as the boat beneath us, as real as the terror that had my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The creature continued to circle us, occasionally bumping the boat as if testing our defenses. Each impact sent shudders through the small craft, and I knew it was only a matter of time before we capsized. "We need to distract it," I said, an idea forming in my panic-addled brain. "Tom, do we have any of those big fish we caught earlier?" Tom nodded, seemingly unable to speak. He reached into the cooler with trembling hands and pulled out a large pike. "When I say go," I whispered, "throw it as far as you can away from the boat." Tom nodded again, gripping the fish tightly. We waited, tense and terrified, as the creature made another slow circuit around us. "Now!" I yelled as it passed the bow of the boat. Tom hurled the fish with all his might. It hit the water with a splash about 20 feet away. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a speed that belied its size, the creature turned and shot towards the fish. "Start the engine!" I yelled, already pulling up the anchor. Tom didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled to the back of the boat, yanking on the starter cord. The engine sputtered once, twice, and then roared to life. We took off across the lake, the boat bouncing roughly over the waves created by our wake. I kept my eyes fixed on the spot where we'd last seen the creature, terrified that at any moment I'd see it surging after us. But nothing followed. We made it back to the dock in record time, our hands shaking so badly we could barely tie up the boat. We sat there on the weathered wooden planks for a long time, neither of us speaking, trying to process what we'd just experienced. Finally, Tom broke the silence. "And we can't tell anyone about this," he said, his voice hoarse. "They'll think we're crazy." Part of me wanted to argue, to insist that we report what we'd seen, but I knew he was right. Who would believe us? We had no proof, no evidence beyond our own terrified testimony. In the days and weeks that followed, I found myself obsessively researching lake monsters and cryptids. I read every account I could find of sightings on Lake Champlain, comparing them to what we'd seen. Some details matched, others didn't. The glowing eyes, the serpentine neck, these were consistent with many reports. But the size, the aggression, these seemed unique to our encounter. I couldn't let it go. I found myself drawn back to the lake time and time again, always in daylight, always staying close to shore. I'd scan the water, hoping for another glimpse of the creature, yet terrified of what might happen if I actually saw it again. Tom refused to go back out on the lake. He sold his boat, gave up fishing entirely. We don't talk much anymore. I think the memory of that night is too much for him to bear, but I can't stay away. There's something out there in the depths of Lake Champlain, something that shouldn't exist in our world of science and reason. And part of me, the part that isn't paralyzed by fear, is fascinated by it. I've started going out at night again, in a larger, more stable boat. I tell myself I'm just fishing, but I know the truth. I'm looking for it, hoping for another encounter, another chance to prove to myself that I'm not crazy, that what we saw that night was real. Sometimes, when the moon is full and the lake is still, I think I see something moving beneath the surface. A shadow larger than any fish, a disturbance in the water that can't be explained by wind or waves. And sometimes, just sometimes, I catch a glimpse of those glowing eyes watching me from the depths. I know it's dangerous. I know that next time I might not be so lucky, but I can't stay away. The lake calls to me, its secrets beckoning. And somewhere out there, in the dark waters of Lake Champlain, something is waiting. Something that challenges everything we think we know about the world around us. So I'll keep going back, night after night, rod in hand and fear in my heart. Because now I know the truth. There are monsters in this world. Real, living monsters. And they're closer than we ever dared to imagine.